Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Could I have your attention, please? Welcome. Good evening. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and members of the press, I'm Shitij Kapur. I'm the President and Vice-Chancellor of King's College London, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first King's College London election night. Now, this is an event that's hosted by our Policy Institute, by our UK in a Changing Europe Institute, by our Strand Group, by our King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership, our International School of Government, and our NIHR Health and Social Care Workforce Research Unit. Tells you how many units it takes to get this evening together. Thank you very much for your presence. I am sure this is a night you will remember. I think, now that's often said, but I'm reasonably confident that when people will ask you, where were you on the 4th of July, you will know where you were. And I think that's because of a number of reasons. I think for right or wrong reasons, there is a lot of anticipation of change. And there is also a lot of fond hope that the world will be a dramatically better place tomorrow. Now, we'll see if that actually turns out to be the case. But let's indulge ourselves this evening. But the other reason why this is here is perhaps to underline two things. You could have spent this evening with your friends, with your family, in a nice local pub, had more fun. I think the reason you're here is for two things. One is to acknowledge the value of expertise. There is something about experts. There is something about people who've devoted themselves to an issue, studied it in a scholarly fashion within a university or without, and when they come together to have a balanced, sensible discussion. So I think that is the first thing we're here to celebrate. And the second thing, dare I say, is the convening power of universities. There was a thought in the last few years that maybe universities were irrelevant to the public discourse, or maybe they were wokish in a certain kind. But I think your presence here today in large numbers tells us that universities are still and can be the centers of meaningful public debate. So that is what we hope to see here today. There's an impressive array of experts from politics, from policy, from media, from the academy, and we are going to have an evening of insightful commentary, lively debate, and of course, plenty of refreshments in the other room should you wish to have those. So it is now time for me to hand over to those who will conduct the evening, and that is Professor Bobby Duffy. Bobby is the director of the King's Policy Institute and will guide us through the night's proceedings. Bobby, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Shitij. It's just excellent to see so many friends and colleagues here for what is going to be, as Shitij says, a really exciting night, whatever the outcome. And it's been a real pleasure putting it together, working with colleagues across the Policy Institute, our great faculty of social science and public policy, and then King's as a whole. It really is an incredible group of colleagues who are trying to make a real difference to policy and practice. And as part of that, I'd like to give particular thanks to Anand Menon and the UK in a Changing Europe team. They're an independent ESRC centre based at King's, and I think, and many agree with me, that they're the leading academic think tank of their type in the UK. So tonight is a really simple format. In a few minutes, we're going to hear from our keynote speakers, Baroness Louise Casey and Lord David Willetts, who are incredible long-term friends of the Policy Institute and King's in their visiting professor roles that they have here. Then we'll have a panel chaired by Anand Menon, and this amazing range of leading commentators who'll be looking back at the campaign mostly. I'm sure they'll cover whatever they like, I'm sure they will, but looking at how the campaign has played out. Then we will have a break, about 9:15, 9:10, that sort of time, because tonight is as much about you meeting each other. We've got an incredible audience as well as an incredible set of speakers, and we have plenty of space for that, as Shitij says, on the south side over there with drinks and lots of food to keep you going, and with an incredible terrace with a view down the river to Westminster. I think one of the best views in London of that kind of view. So during the break, or indeed any time you like, do have a go at our exit poll prediction quiz, where you can get the QR code, but it's also on your seats, where you can win this incredibly cheap prize. We got this from Timpson's on the Causeway, just on Kingsway, sorry, just up the road. And we spent the extra £2 to get it engraved with election expert King's College London on there. So that's not an official qualification, but it does come with incredible glory attached to it. Then at 10 o'clock, we will put the telly on in here on the big screen and watch the exit poll drop. And give you a few minutes to watch and react to that, because with no intended slight to our amazing panelists and speakers, the exit poll in some ways is going to be the star of the show this evening. It's an incredible piece of work by leading academics across the country and Ipsos, who do the data collection. And I'm, in my another role, I'm chair of the Campaign for Social Science, which is part of the Academy of Social Sciences. And I think we should be really proud of the social science expertise that goes into the exit poll. So that will tell us very quickly whether the prediction polls that we've seen so many of, the MRP polls, everything else, are correct or wrong. On prediction polls, I think it's safe to say we've had a mixed bag over the past few electoral events, as we can see here. In 2010, general election 2010, it was incredibly accurate, hardly any error in the final prediction polls. 2014, the independence referendum in Scotland, that was also really strong showing. Then it went a bit wrong. In 2015 general election, it didn't go so well, and then maybe we don't want to talk too much about the Brexit referendum polling as well, not so great, and even slightly worse in the 2017 general election. But then it bounced back incredibly for the 2019 general election. Again, came back to really strong level of accuracy. So I used to run election polling at Ipsos when I worked there. I worked on 2010, worked on 2014, but the real period I was in charge was that period there, until I moved away from that side of things into King's in 2018. So I don't take all the blame for everything that went wrong in those days, but I think we can be reassured that I've had no involvement in prediction polling during this election. So we shouldn't have too many surprises. So after we've had a few minutes to reflect on the election, we'll take in the election poll from the telly. We'll have our final panel chaired by Jill Rutter with another real blockbuster set of speakers. And that'll move us much more towards the substantive issues and challenges facing the new government, the policy, economic, foreign affairs choices that we're going to face. And we'll wrap up everything by 11:15. Give out our prize, including giving out our prize, so that people can go on to other parties, other events. There is a brilliant event over the road by our good colleagues at LSE. Tony Travers is here tonight, our good friend. So do head towards LSE or to another party, or sensibly go home to watch the results in bed, or even more sensibly, go to sleep and wake up the next morning when we actually know what's going to happen, what's happened. So, brilliant night ahead of us, and we're just going to get started straight away with our keynote. So I'd like to ask Louise and David to come and join me on the stage. Then we'll hear first from Lord David Willetts on his views of the campaign and what comes next. David.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me along, and thank you, Bobby, for your eloquent evidence of how tough the financial crisis in higher education is. What more evidence do we need about the desperate straits of higher education? So thank you for inviting me along, and you asked me to talk about campaigns. I thought I might, thank heavens this one is over. Thank heavens we're about to be liberated from what has been, I think from almost every respect, a terrible campaign. And I just wanted to compare it with one or two campaigns of which I have more direct experience. The first campaign I was heavily involved in was in 1987, when I was in charge of briefing Margaret Thatcher every morning for the daily press conference, when she had half an hour of wide-ranging, unpredictable questions from journalists sitting in a group like that. And my main aim, she was enjoying it so much, was to try to get her off the stage after half an hour before she made any more wild observations or comments. But that was proper scrutiny of our manifesto and what she thought, and I had to, the job in the morning was to go through every angle that she might get, especially in the light of that morning's media story, and take her through it before she went out on stage. And I have to say, I think one of the problems that we have at the moment is that level of scrutiny, which does at least command public interest, has completely collapsed. Then, two campaigns that I was heavily involved in was being in the lead in writing the manifestos for the Conservative elections of 1997 and 2001. I was heavily involved in the manifestos that led to the Conservative Party's worst two landslide defeats since the war. And it's just possible tonight I will no longer have that badge of shame. So it's a kind of liberation for that reason. There may be some poor sods who face an even worse record. But again, those manifestos, they did at least have quite a lot of substance in them. What has gone wrong since? And I think two things in particular have stripped a lot of the substance away from elections. One was the 2017 social care episode, in which I think everyone comes out badly. But the aim in 2017 was to level with the electorate that if we were to have a social care funding package, it was reasonable to expect older people who were sitting on substantial assets, not to pay up front, but have it as a charge on their estate after their death to help fund social care. And if there's any one reason why all parties are very wary, and why incidentally social care is still stuck, is all the fake horror and shock and media outrage and costing the Tories the majority they were heading for. The lesson for any observant politician from that is just don't risk it. It is more trouble than it's worth. Don't try to level with the electorate. It won't work. And then the other problem we've got, of course, is Brexit, which should be the key issue, because a lot of the economics that we're facing, a lot of the tricky problems we face are a result of Brexit. But the whole experience of the Brexit referendum was so traumatic that nobody can face going back to one of the most painful periods of our political history. So we've ended up, and I think I saw Paul Johnson here already. Paul has quite rightly expressed the frustration that the sheer sort of failure to engage with the fiscal challenge that any incoming government will face. We did at Resolution Foundation an event which just showed that if you lower the productivity forecast in the OBR are currently assuming 1.1% a year improvements in productivity. The actual rate of improvements in productivity is 0.7%. If you just assume 0.9%, splitting the difference, that on its own adds something like 17 billion a year to public borrowing. And we expect that one of the uncomfortable conversations facing, let's face it, the incoming Labour government will be the OBR saying, of course, Chancellor, you have a very powerful rhetoric about raising Britain's productivity performance. However, we're going to, in our next publication, we're going to show a lower rate of productivity improvement than the one we offered Jeremy Hunt, and it's going to knock your fiscal calculations out by more than the total cost of all the measures you've announced during the election campaign. And there's dozens at least of issues like that, and Paul has rightly been frustrated they haven't been surfaced. So I think all through the summer we're going to have Labour ministers saying, I've opened the books and I'm shocked. I am shocked. I didn't expect things to be this bad. It's completely unexpected. It's a blow and it's appalling. I never realized it would be anything like that. That is going to be the narrative of the summer, and there will be a degree of cynicism when that is what they say. But meanwhile, what about opposition? Just let me end with some observations about opposition. And I can still remember the moment of trauma if you were an MP, and I was elected first in 1992 with a healthy majority down in Havant. I can remember the 1997 count when the ballot boxes are emptied, and before they get into the detail counting, they just pile up the ballot papers party by party. I thought, bloody hell, the Labour pile is much, much higher than I expected. My majority went down from 12,000 to about 3,000. And it was then the moment of truth is when you come back to the House of Commons and have the first vote. And as you know, in the House of Commons, you go through the aye lobby and the no lobby. So you go through the lobbies where you're used to have gone through with 350 fellow MPs. And now when you vote, you've got 170 fellow MPs. As one colleague turned to me and said, we've gone from economy class to business class. It's a shock when you suddenly realize how much you are diminished. And you comfort yourself, looking back to 13 years of opposition before, with the observation that opposition is an honourable function. Every country in the world has got a government. What is special is having an opposition as well. So try to do the job properly. It's an important part of the functioning of a democracy. But the fewer MPs there are, the harder it is. Less short money, fewer places on select committees. Although there's not a sudden trigger of a supermajority, but the bigger the number of Labour MPs relative to Conservative MPs, the harder it's going to be for the Conservatives to do the official job of always fielding a competent person to ask some reasonable questions every time any minister stands up with any statement in the House of Commons. Is going to be tough. And where will we head from here? Some final observations. Well, I think the danger is a sort of Conservative psychodrama. I hope we are capable of being a competent opposition, but as someone said, the danger is if you lose an election, after you've offered the electorate ham and eggs and you lose the election, one of the first instinctive emotional reactions of the opposition say, okay, how about double ham and double eggs? And you find that gets rejected as well. So one may find that opposition, proper opposition, happens elsewhere. And let me end with two examples. So for Margaret Thatcher, in the 1980s, with her large majorities, she thought the opposition was some kind of alliance of left-wing local authorities, trade unions, and the EU. She thought the opposition was Arthur Scargill and Ken Livingstone and Jacques Delors. And those were the people she actually thought stood in the way of her trying to do what she was aiming for, and became increasingly preoccupied with that. That's one model, becomes extra-parliamentary. The other model, which I saw in the years post-1997, is the governing party is so big that it breaks and divides, and the opposition is an internal argument. It's Blair v. Brown. That's another model of opposition. And we couldn't work out in the shadow cabinet whether Blair v. Brown was totally dysfunctional or a brilliant Labour strategy to ensure that the entire national political debate happened within the Labour Party and made us totally irrelevant. Now, who knows what will happen this time round, but I personally think that Labour will find it very hard to get stuff done, much harder than they realise. They'll find, in my experience, many incoming ministers, what shocks them is how everything they do is justiciable, everything will face a challenge of some sort, and how Keir Starmer reacts to finding that the lawyers of the opposition will be a fascinating political moment. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, okay, so King's, and particularly Bobby, has form in the fact that they ask me to speak at things, and then they always pit me against brilliant speakers. So year before last, it was John Major. That nearly terrified the life out of me. Last year, it was now these are the jokes for the evening. The rest of what I'm going to say is so fecking miserable that, you know, you might as well enjoy the laugh whilst you can. And then last year, it was national hero now, Ed Balls. And this year, it's Two Brains. So, you know, thanks so much, everyone. I think, actually, this very expensive trophy that, you know, King's has invested in is definitely for mine. So, look, actually, David, you've said a couple of things I'm going to have to say something about, and I didn't really, you know. So, look, the first thing I want to say is, actually, I think the country is in a complete and utter state, and I think that people haven't been upfront about it, and I think that's part of the problem. We've had 14 years, and probably a little bit before the 14 years, of people either blaming someone else or actually not taking responsibility for sometimes difficult decisions, and a head in the sand about actually, I think that there is a consensus, and I, you know, have actually looked at some of this ahead of the election, and I've been silent actually deliberately, and I'm not going to be particularly political tonight until after 10 o'clock, that essentially, you know, I am like every other member of the public, which is it does feel like Britain needs fixing. And, you know, wages haven't kept up with the cost of living. Ordinary people genuinely are worried about money every single day. And I really mean worried about money every single day. You know, it's not that, you know, they're not worried about whether the cost of a cappuccino has gone up at, you know, St. Pancras Station. They're genuinely, a huge number of people now are concerned about money that probably aren't people in the room tonight. Let's be honest about it. The ordinary hope, actually, of something called home ownership, which actually, for various reasons, has been the only show in town in housing now for as long as I remember. I remember I was the Deputy Director of Shelter long before I became the Homelessness Czar. And I'm not saying that's a wrong thing to go down the route of home ownership, but just be honest about it. And if that's the only show in town, then actually you have to make home ownership actually attainable for people. You can't just pretend it's going to be attainable for people, and if people work harder, then somehow they can make it, not when your own research, many better people doing research in the room than me, will show you that working poor is the biggest shift in poverty in my working life. So people are working as well as being poor. You know, Wes has got the guy, if they get elected, Wes will have his work cut out with the sort of inaccessible, really, health just feels inaccessible to people. You know, the GPs, you put the radio on, you hear it all the time, the latest scandal around dentists. Actually, let's talk about women in maternity care. Let's just imagine a moment that's gone downhill in the last 15 years. Let's not try and pretend that it wasn't brilliant. It wasn't brilliant before 2010. It's not so great now at all, and we don't really talk about it because women, on the whole, just get on with their lives and hope that they can have this wonderful moment in their life without it being traumatizing. You know, and that's before we get onto waiting lists. I do think there's a massive issue. I agree with David about social care, and we just use this expression like a soundbite, as if we are actually understanding that there's one thing that's going to happen to every single person in this room, is you're going to get old and you're going to die. You know, cheery, I said, bear with me. You know, I haven't even had a drink yet, so imagine what it's going to be like later. You know, there is literally only one show in town, and it's dying. And as we move towards that, we actually get frail. And why have we got our heads in the sand about it? Because it's in the all too difficult box. It's the one bit of the welfare state that nobody, you know, we wouldn't say now, I'll tell you what, we won't bother with education, we won't bother with health, we won't bother with work, we won't, you know, we'll actually, as tough as we are about benefits, we're not going to cut them completely, despite George Osborne's attempt to do so. We're not going to do that. And yet there we are, you know, and I just find these things really difficult. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Perpetrators of crime are not found and are not brought to justice. The attrition rate, i.e. the people we catch, is 13%. That means, I don't know what that percentage is, but the vast majority I do. I'm just taking the piss because I'm in a, you know, come on. It's election night. Lighten up, everyone. These are terribly serious statistics. That basically the attrition rate, i.e. the people we actually catch for committing crime, get away with it. One cop said to me last year, because if you think, I think for rape in the Metropolitan Police, it's 9%, which means 91% of people get away with committing rape. I mean, can these statistics be any worse, really? And work doesn't pay. Work just doesn't pay, right? So people like me were brought up believing by my parents that if I worked hard and had a good education, I would make it. Right now, social mobility, whatever you want to call it, social justice, my brother and I would not be standing here, let alone a baroness, but I certainly wouldn't be standing here. I'd never have made it to where I am if I'd had to progress in the last 15 years. And my brother is a judge, and he definitely would never have made it either. We were both in David's constituency, and we were in Lee Park. So that is not the nicest area to be brought up in, but my God, we did a good job. And actually, the irony is, I went to the same school as Penny Mordaunt and John Cruddas. So that tells you the school was good. You know, you may disagree with them politically, John Cruddas and Penny, I mean, I'm sure you will agree with me. I have to laugh at my own jokes because nobody else does. I have to remind people to laugh at my jokes, and that's such a sad state of affairs, isn't it? But, you know, it's been a long 6 weeks, folks, is all I can say. And then the borders aren't controlled. There's no point pretending that we're controlling borders. We're not controlling them, and immigration is not being managed. And anybody that tries to tell the general public that's true, they know that you're lying. And, you know, let's face it, to most people, energy and water companies just appear as racketeers, really, demanding public bailouts as they sold off the furniture years ago, and now they want us to bail them out. So that's before I get onto things like transport, broken down trains, lived with that today, potholes, global worries like climate change, security, defence, and technology is advancing in this absolutely extraordinary way, but we appear to be frightened of it. So we're getting that right then as well, aren't we? So yes, David, if they spend the next 6 months saying, thank you, Liam Byrne, for the note that said the money's run out, which George Osborne used relentlessly to justify austerity, then yes, I think we will find that they shouldn't arrive tomorrow. I'm not involved in telling them what to do, but it would be absolutely daft to arrive tomorrow and say they can solve everything I've just talked about. And if they try to, they'll join the long line of people that overspin. Spin started under Labour as a sort of science, really, and I think they should regret it. I don't think spinning is something to be proud of. The same way I like people to tell the truth. I'd rather somebody said to me, Louise, you can't have what you want, more cops on the streets, because we haven't got any money. I'd rather somebody was honest with me than actually pretend that they're going to do something they don't do it. And they will spend months trying to work out what they can deliver on. So the thing I was going to say is the size of the problems. Oh, and also, sorry, David, we've known each other a long time, and you won't mind this. There is such an irony when you hear politicians go, got to make sure we have a decent opposition. Nobody in the Conservative Party would be saying that if they thought they were looking at a landslide tomorrow. You know, it just doesn't happen. So, you know, let's all, and you know, I doubt there will be a landslide tomorrow for anyone, but I don't know. There are pollsters in the room that know better. The most important thing for me is the simplicity of just being honest and straight. I would rather people did a few things really well than pretend they're going to do everything and spin that they reckon they've done it better. Like, bring waiting lists down, you know, pick a couple of big issues that are impossible, like immigration and social care, and let's see where we can get. I don't think the left can keep dodging things like immigration, crime, housing and social care. And the reason I say that is because I also have a request of the Conservatives on the centre, which is my real worry about everything at the moment, actually, is that unless I am a centrist, right, I'm probably left of centre, but, you know, I am quite tough about crime. You know, I will build a few more prisons if I can get a few more rapists in them, you know, guilty as charged. You know, I am quite tough on certain issues, particularly law and order. But overall, I think the problem I've got is that if the centre, as it were, if the great centrists, of which, dare I say it, despite me disagreeing with you, Cameron, that group led something in the middle, if that just doesn't actually have any, you know, there's a bit of sort of, I want to ask George Osborne, do you have any regrets now about what you did in those first 5 years? The same way I actually want to ask Tony Blair, is there anything that he regrets that means that perhaps things could have been better? Like, if people can't own the fact that if we don't occupy that ground, then essentially the right and people I just don't want in charge of this country will take charge. You know, you all know this, you're all political aficionados. As you said, everybody's here tonight because, you know, we all love politics. And my worry is that if this government doesn't succeed, and one of the things it has to succeed in is making politics better and working more towards consensus and truth and dignity and politeness, as well as doing what you say you're going to do and not always ignoring somebody just because they're in opposition, then essentially I don't see how actually we can stem the tide of what's happening in the rest of Europe and, dare I say it, in the rest of the world. And I would say those are the stakes, not just tonight, but actually in what happens in the months and years from where we are here. And that's That's why I think this is one of the most important elections, but actually one of the most important things is what happens after this election, not just what the government does, but what we all choose to do. And then finally, I just wanted to say, you know, the most extraordinary thing is, is I just think that optimism and hope is something we can all own, wherever you are politically, on whatever bit you're on, right? Whichever way you look at it, everybody actually wants those list of things I've talked about to be solved. You know, I don't believe that people, I worked for David Cameron on the Troubled Families programme. I worked for Tony Blair on the Family Intervention programme. There's not much difference between those two programmes, right? One was done on a red banner. Cameron came along and said he wanted to do it for slightly different reasons, but the same outcome. Painted it blue and pressed on. Do you know what I mean? So there is something here about some things that are just right to do in society, that we should just do right and do it well. And that's where they wouldn't let me do this because it would take too long. But last year, and I'm waiting for somebody to finally invite me to Glastonbury or sit on the thing for 300 hours trying to get a ticket. And obviously then I'd have to sleep in a tent, which is not going to feckin' happen. So I don't know what would happen there. I don't want to pretend to be homeless just for music. And so, I mean, last year, right, there was that really miserable time again. I think we'd been here, all's a bit shit, life's a bit difficult, I've just gone over a pothole, you know, you can't get your mum into a care home, etc., etc. And Lewis Capaldi couldn't hold it together. Do you remember? Do you know him? He's the guy with Tourette's. And he goes to sing that absolutely lovely song that they won't let me sing. And he couldn't get through it. And the entire group, mainly of young people, sung it for him and sung it to him. And it made my heart swell with this enormous power I think children and young people have. And even when I'm cynical and worried and this and the other, I think of the Lewis Capaldi moment. Fast forward to something called Coldplay, much more my time, very happy, excellent, Coldplay, know the band, know everything. And this year you had the absolutely extraordinary moment of I Will Try to Fix You. And I used to drive home, my mother was in hospital in Southampton, and I used to drive along the A27 back to Havant every night when she was dying in hospital, and just before we managed to get her in a hospice, all of which happened under Labour watch, not under the Conservative watch, just to be clear. It was a long time ago. And I used to leave the hospital at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning because I didn't want to leave her on her own, and I would be back by 5 or 6 a.m. the following morning. Because even then, and this was a Labour government, even then the quality of care in that hospital was just not good enough. And I therefore couldn't leave her. I mean, it could have been where my head was and my heart was, but it wasn't good enough. And so I would drive along the A27 and I would put Fix It on. I Will Try to Fix You with Coldplay. And when I saw that this weekend or last week, I thought to myself, it doesn't matter. And I put it on because I knew I couldn't fix her, but I knew that I could do something about making the world that she had brought me up in to be a better place. And that's why I'm emotional tonight, because that's my expectations of this election, my expectations of really good and decent politicians like David Willetts, and why I want the country to get better, because we need to fix it. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, you did really well. That was amazing. Louise, just congratulating yourself there on sticking only to time. That is a first.
It's a first.
That is a first. That was amazing, incredibly disciplined. So we don't have long for this little session.
Just an hour for this session.
Because we want to get on to our commentator panel. But I did want to just come back to David and Louise on, I think that's absolutely right about trust being at the centre of this and the relationship with actually delivering for people. Because you'll have seen the British social attitudes data and lots of the survey work that we've done, the plummeting levels of trust in government. And what our work shows on the World Value Survey is this is not a short-term issue. This is not an acute crisis. This is a long-term chronic condition that's going to take a lot of work to turn around for most of the people in the country. So I did want to just ask each of you, if I could, from all of that menu of things that we could do to fix the country, are there one or two things that you think that the new government really needs to focus on, particularly early on in the next Parliament? David, have you got any thoughts on what should be first if we're trying to rebuild that connection?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would just say that one of the many shocks in line for incoming ministers is how you don't have complete power to shape the agenda. And it will be external. A lot of the time, and I suspect there'll be a lot of briefs being read over the weekend where there'll be incoming fire, there'll be decisions that have got to be taken urgently, maybe that have been delayed, that are very tricky. I have to say, and we're going to hear from Alan and others later on, I do think there is a moment for a change in the relationship with the EU, because there is, after all, we've got, after the elections, there's going to be a new EU Commission as well. And if you're serious about growth, it's very hard to proceed without a better relationship with the EU. I personally would put that as a high priority. And secondly, and I take a lot of Louise's very powerful points, there are a lot of people struggling to make ends meet on very low incomes indeed. And the sort of low economic growth really hits them. And a point that the way I put this to my Conservative friends is that if you look at the British economy and our GDP per head lower than in France or Germany, and then look at living standards, you find that the top 20% of people in Britain, their real disposable incomes, their living standards are comparable with the living standards of the top 20% of people in France or Germany. The burden of adjustment to being a poorer performing economy is borne by the less affluent half of the British people, whose living standards are significantly lower than the less affluent half of people in France or Germany or the Netherlands in our resolution research. And I say, no wonder we find it hard to build up an appetite and an urge across the political classes and the policymakers and the business leaders to do something about our terrible economic performance, because most of the decision takers are protected from the consequences of this poor economic performance. And so I do think that the standard of boosting, the challenge of boosting living standards, and it means tax and benefits, and of course it means real growth, I think that would be my second priority.
Very good.
I think my first priority would be growth, actually. If growth means more jobs, more income, some of the solution to the cost of living. But I feel more optimistic about some of the things that you could just get on with, actually. So let's go to an area which I know is important to some people in the room. If you look at something like violence against women and girls, you just look at the fact that we... I know it made unfortunate headlines, but if you look at the Metropolitan Police, and I now know this isn't just the Metropolitan Police, we don't have enough working fridges for specimens. So when a woman is raped or a child seriously sexually abused, we take physical specimens. Those of you that work in the world of crime will know the best thing you can put into a courtroom in order to get somebody brought to justice is either CCTV, because juries love them, the CPS love them, the police love them, it makes your charging decision straightforward, and anything you can get that's the equivalent of that is a game changer. Yet, the way we have basically done this is for various austerity reasons. Each police force was given the National Forensic Service went out the window, every police force commissions their own stuff, and actually what you get is you're more prepared to send people on a training course than you are to have a 500 quid fridge that will keep your kit in a way that you can put into a courtroom. You could just tomorrow decide you were going to do that different, because that's chip money. There's nothing expensive about that. It's whether there's a will, there's a way. And I've got a list of things like that. And I definitely would also start with, I think that you could do something relatively quickly about the 144,000 families who are in one room, and it's not one bedroom, it's one room, with children growing up in that situation. So you may not be able to solve an immediate issue of housing, so I would go up here and I'd connect housing with growth. So I'm not, you know, housing, great, we'll have it, but it should be entirely connected to where you're seeking to create jobs and industrial strategy and growth. So housing and growth and industrial will be put in the same place. They're not at the moment. And then down in the actual real world, you should, within literally 2.5 to 3 years, if not sooner, find a way to stop the scandal. And it is a scandal. Honestly, I have never, ever seen anything. I've worked in this area for I can't remember, I was a volunteer in a night shelter when I was 19, and I know I only look 39, but believe me, ladies and gentlemen, I'm 59, and essentially I went to something that we would call modular housing the other week with this BBC Fixing Britain thing, and I thought, Jesus, Mary and Joseph, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. And so I think those sorts of things you could move on quickly, and I think if you looked at each one of their missions, there are things that you would pull out and move on it in order to show that you were doing something to actually make the public feel that there was movement in some way on something they cared about. At the same time, you do the bigger stuff.
Can I be the very boring civil servant doing the brief for the minister who comes in with a powerful point like that? And so, and Louise knows far more about this than me, okay, there's a problem about not sufficient fridge capacity in forensic labs and police quarters. Are you suggesting, Minister, there should be a pot of money entitled fridge for specimens? Is that a specific budget? We don't manage the court service by writing a cheque saying this is money to be spent in the fridge, or do you want an increase in the overall court's budget? If it's an increase in the overall court's budget, how much is actually going to go on fridges? How do you ensure, do we spend another instruction on fridges? These are the boring, the people who have campaigned in poetry and then govern in prose are immediately going to find all these type of practical issues.
So I agree that having been a poacher turned gamekeeper and gamekeeper turned poacher, I've been on the side of being appointed to drive things through, and actually I was a civil servant throughout that period. And I think there is something there about actually people not always, you know, the yes minister thing. I agree that does exist. But I also think that if you take that particular example, there's an existing budget in every single police force for how they do evidence collection and all the rest of it. And I looked at it and I thought, if you just put that together in a different way, and that's where you just have to, there's a great BBC Radio 4 series done called Fixing Britain with somebody called Louise Casey. And in it, one of the things we cover is the sort of lessons of how you deal with government, joking aside. And I think what David has said is very, very true, but there are ways through it. And, you know, having done it for 18 years, and we didn't get everything right, but we did move the dial on most of the delivery things that I was leading or involved with. Not always brilliantly, but I think, you know, and that does take, actually, it's quite interesting, that does take a Prime Minister to decide what are their priorities and how often they're going to push them. It takes Secretary of States to own them, because they'll all be, whoever's elected overnight, there'll be letters going out at some point tomorrow saying this is what I want you to do. And people in number 10 really believe those letters are going to be received and worked upon. And, you know, the minute they walk back, they all walk into Downing Street collaborative and they walk back down Downing Street thinking, my fiefdom, great, lovely, I'm now in charge. And, you know, I'm going to do my own thing. I've made my moment. This is me. And so there are techniques, though, I think, I certainly feel that there are techniques that you can bring to bear to make sure those things don't happen.
Great. Just a final question for me, because we are eating into the panel's time. So I think you're absolutely right about the next election looks absolutely vital for the future of the country, depending on what happens between now and then. Whether the next government can succeed in making people feel better about things seems absolutely vital. And a lot of our work on culture wars and all the related things around how divided or polarised the country could become in the absence of the types of success and progress that you're talking about. So I just want to get your prediction and feeling, if we're fast forwarding to 2029 or the next election, how confident are you? What do you think it will feel like at that time? Do you have a sense of confidence and optimism or not? And that's our final bit, and then we will make way.
Be optimistic.
David.
Louise is urging me to be optimistic, and I will be optimistic. I think that, and it's a classic observation, governments can do less in the short run than people expect, but can do more in the long run. And if you have a government that doesn't wish to fight culture wars, and doesn't wish to divide people that way, and never provides ammunition or material that promotes that type of challenge, you can, over time, you do actually influence the way that politics is debated. And a lot of things, there's a lot of indirect influence that politicians in general, but governments in particular have. And I'll give you a forecast for April 2029. I chair the UK Space Agency. Yeah. An asteroid will come very close to Earth in April 2029. At one point, it was forecast to get very close. The latest view, it will be 30,000 kilometres away, but it will be for an asteroid pretty close and visible to the naked eye from large parts of Earth. So they will have a sort of astronomical symbol at the end of their term.
Wow! So you heard it here first from the chair of the Space Agency.
I can't top the asteroid thing. No, absolutely can't top that, so I might sing a Coldplay song. But so I think that the stakes are so high for the Conservatives, the Conservatives, that they will have to grapple with where they are. And if you think that, reform will, at the moment, look like they're on the ascendancy in various places, and it's the Conservatives that must grip that in some way. And I think I therefore agree with David that what we need, I would call it something different, but less divided politics, more consensus politics, but politics that are totally connected to the public. Government is by the people, for the people, of the people, and it doesn't feel by the people, of the people, for the people. And when it disassociates from being of the people, you end up with division. And so I think it's incumbent on any political party who wants not nastiness and not, anybody whose skin colour isn't quite right for them, suddenly suffering again, not that they have not suffered, but you know what I mean, just becoming acceptable, then I think it's incumbent on everyone to make sure that the next administration and then the following administration and politics grows up and behaves how we should expect them to do so. All of us should do that, basically.
Brilliant. Great way to end. Thank you so much to David and Louise. Brilliant.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, thank you.
We drank that whole bottle of water.
Don't worry.
We drank all your water. You might need water and
we'll put another one there. Just going to welcome Anand. You can go do. Cheers.
So I'm just going to start with a reflection on the last 5 years and we'll go from there. Conversation. I think we're going to kick off. My name's Anand Menon from King's College, Director of UK and the Changing Europe. Can I just say this is so exciting? I mean, it's exciting because I get childishly excited about elections whenever they happen, whatever they are actually, wherever they are, I get childishly excited about elections. But also, I mean, this is exciting because this is what universities should do. I mean, yes, we should teach, yes, we should research, but actually the other thing we should do is be a place where that research meets people who make policy, talk about policy, be an interface between expertise and the real world. And before we start, I just want to thank Bobby for creating in the Policy Institute a place where doing that is really easy. And I think it's something historically, universities haven't done very well, but he and his team, and I'd like to think to an extent we and our team, are wrestling with it, and it's something we here are very, very proud of, and I think, Bobby, you should be very proud of too. But enough. Was that going to be a round of applause? That's very exciting. Here we go. Right. You've got the bios of our speakers behind me, so I won't do that. But let me just say, if you haven't read Sophie's stuff on our website, particularly her Seats to Watch guide for tonight, you should, because it will give you the crib sheet you need to understand the election. If you haven't read David's Substack, you should subscribe to it, because it's always fascinating. You can never ever predict what the next one's about, actually, which is one of the things I like about it.
Yeah, I certainly can't.
That's super. It's well worth doing. If you haven't read Marie's dispatches from the campaign trail, which have been one of the brightest bits of the election, quite frankly, for me, go to the website and find them, because they're often hilarious. And if you haven't read his sketches, you haven't lived. So we've been asked to reflect back on the campaign, so I'm going to break the rules, because actually it strikes me that we shouldn't start with the campaign. We should just reflect briefly on the last 5 years, because I remember the last election quite clearly. I remember Boris Johnson and his team planning for a minimum of 10 years in power. So for anyone who wants to go first, it's been crazy, hasn't it? What are your sort of thoughts and reflections on how it went from that to this?
I think
we'll start with the sketch writer, because it seems most appropriate.
I mean, there were clues that he was like this, I think, is what I would say. It was. That's the thing about Boris, right? He's good at the driving the diggers through the polystyrene blocks bit, less good at all of the other aspects of the job. And actually, the Tories knew this. There was a fantastic, it was worth looking out, fantastic Conservative Home leader during the 2019 leadership contest, where they said, obviously Boris Johnson should be Prime Minister, but it would be great if he appointed Jeremy Hunt to sort of run the government on a day-to-day basis. And you thought, well, if you're saying that, you don't want him to be Prime Minister. So I think that it was sort of, I mean, I wouldn't say that nothing in the last 5 years surprised me, because it's all been a constant cycle of delight. But nothing in the last 5 years is desperately surprising. Is it surprising that Boris Johnson would set a bunch of laws and then break them? No, it's not. No, is it surprising that the Conservative Party would struggle with anything that presented it with an ideological problem, which COVID did, which subsequent sort of growth problems did? No, it's not, because they're riven, because they're still sort of riven by Brexit. They can't decide what kind of part of it, are they open, are they closed, as someone put it this week. So no, it's been brilliant, but not surprising. Brilliant for me.
No, I completely agree. And sorry, I feel I'm slightly shorter than Rob, so I'm just going to very sort of, I mean, I'm not surprised either, but I think on the kind of slightly more boring electoral point, I think they managed to assemble an electoral coalition that was completely unwieldy, that was far too big to actually work. And they sort of learned the wrong lessons, I think, from 2019 as well, in that if you look, I think Theresa May, weirdly, was forgotten by history on this. Now, if you look at a lot of the seats the Tories gained in 2019, that was actually Theresa May in 2017 who got them sort of like nearly there. And then Boris swooped in and, got the extra little votes here and there, and then that turned into a massive landslide due to the electoral system here. So I think they kind of came in and, Boris was like, great, I'm now God Emperor, I can do anything. And A, that was not the case, but B, again, even I think beyond the personal force of Boris Johnson, I can't really think of anyone who could have kept that electoral coalition together in any meaningful way, because they just promised everything to everyone, both during the Brexit referendum and in 2019. And amazingly, you can't actually offer everything to everyone, especially if the economy is not quite thriving. I think in 97, Labour could sort of get away with doing a bit of that because there was money. So you could be like, there are no losers here, everyone's a winner. Given the state the economy was in between 2019 and now, that is not something you can do. So yeah, not surprised either.
I mean, I Googled it the other day, and when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, growth was 4.5%, which sounds like an unreachable nirvana nowadays. But, I mean, David, on the same sort of thing, and I'm not going to try and launch a defence of the Johnson government, but they were massively unlucky, weren't they? Because if you create a coalition based on values at the tail end of austerity, the one thing you really don't want hurtling down the road at you is a pandemic that A, makes everyone think about the economy, and B, exposes everything you've been doing to the public services for 10 years.
Yeah, you are inviting me to be charitable.
Well, yeah, I'm trying.
This has been a catastrophic government since 2010. The Conservative Party in office has been everything that it has done long term, it has done badly. Just about everything. I think we can accept 2 or 3 policy decisions which weren't like that. And going back to 2019, if you remember, the great narrative that was created out of the 2019 election, which was seen somehow as an archetypal election, when actually it was a freak election, was that there had been the great realignment. And the right people on the right politics firmly believed this. They believed that Britain had moved into a completely different political situation in which the Conservative Party were now representing beg pardon, the working classes of Britain, etc., in a way that Labour didn't. This was a kind of great narrative and so on. Actually, what had happened is some of our colleagues, in the academic business have got quite rich on this thesis. But actually, what was being shown was a great de-alignment. And that's what we've been seeing in British politics, a huge de-alignment. It's far more contractual. In other words, people want to know what it's going to do for them and their families and this kind of situation they're in, and so on, which is why things have become quite so disastrous this year, because the answer is literally how much better are you off than you were in 2010, in which way? The answer is you're not, almost in any kind of way. And the other thing is that if the government got the long-term decisions, such as the disastrous decision to have a referendum on the European Union, absolutely catastrophic, because the question that Cameron had to answer is, what happens if you don't win?
Yeah.
What happens to the future of the country? What happens to growth if you don't win? But also at the same time, to set a target of 100,000, less than 100,000 for immigration, when you couldn't possibly fulfill it and not significantly hit economic growth at the same time, is also catastrophic. And this is a catastrophe, actually, a long-term catastrophe, which all political parties play a part in. Just imagine for a second that we'd actually said to ourselves, isn't it good all these people are coming here? What can we do to make it work better? It's our opportunity. We have consistently said that this is a problem that we've got to solve and come up with completely unrealistic solutions. So by the time you get to 2024, the government cannot be said to have delivered on almost anything that it said it would do. And actually, into the middle of that, I wouldn't have forecast this landslide that we're likely to get. It throws Liz Truss. As a kind of act of sort of ideological desperation or carelessness or recklessness or arrogance. And I think, anyway, I'm in danger of covering the entire field of what's going to happen next, and I should shut up now.
No, because we'll come on to that. I mean, I should say, I feel morally obliged to say we don't know how rich those academics have become because we don't know how many of their subscribers are paying subscribers. So we can buy. But moving on. So, I mean, 2 things, Sophie. I mean, one, to reflect on the last 5 years, because sort of talking in the office, we sort of didn't foresee this until it became inevitable, and it's been quite an interesting story. But secondly, the story that David tells about the electorate becoming more transactional, becoming less wedded to parties, that's a good thing, isn't it? Because it means that politicians can't take their electorates for granted in the way they used to.
Yeah, I mean, looking back on the last 5 years, when the sort of exit poll dropped in 2019, I was in an accounting centre in Sunderland, and I think if you would have told everyone there at that time what was going to happen in 5 years' time, they wouldn't have believed how quickly things had changed. So I think it's definitely a surprise in terms of it. I think it feels like it's creeped up on us, or like all of a sudden this huge Labour majority. But for exactly the reasons that Marie said, that coalition of voters was never going to hold together once the Brexit issue kind of dissipated. That Conservative coalition had nothing in common in terms of its social preferences, economic preferences. Lee Anderson and Rishi Sunak were never meant to be in the same political party. Like, they were never meant to be in the same, party conference room together ever. Exactly, honestly, it was never going to work. So you think about that, but then I think the other thing is that actually a lot of those same voters who lent their vote to the Conservative Party for the first time in 2019 are actually those voters where we see sort of the lowest level of trust in politics, typically the lowest levels of favourability towards politicians, in political involvement. And I think what the real danger is, sort of more than any one party losing or gaining vote, is that this is, the saga of the last few years has just completely reconfirmed their worst fears of politicians. And, they're in it for themselves, they don't care about us, they'll say anything to get our vote. And I think actually the lasting legacy might not be a wipeout for the Conservative Party at this election. It might actually be we see such low levels of turnout and political involvement from those same communities, or we see a swing to a populist party one way or the other. So I think that's the first thing from that. What was your second question? I can't remember. Sorry.
Oh, I can't remember. I was getting so depressed by your first answer. That was
I feel like I brought the news on a little bit. Sorry. I actually, for the life, can't remember what you asked me.
Can I make a point?
Yeah.
You can make a point.
Yeah, it's slightly off topic, but I feel like I've started talking now. So on your point of like transactional politics, I think it's worth saying that I think one of the legacies of this Parliament will be that actually, so on the one hand, I agree. I think people are less party political. They're more likely to vote for, who they see as the person with the right time, etc. But as a result, I think that creates a lot more unpredictable seats and marginal seats. And as we know, MPs in marginal seats tend to be a lot more locally focused and going, and especially over the past Parliament, going a bit like in the US, and if you elect, I went to talk to the Prime Minister to get that bridge built, etc. I feel like we saw a lot more of that in the last 5 years. And I worry that's going to be a slight kind of vicious cycle where MPs start acting a lot more transactionally, but then voters expect that more of their MPs, and so on and so forth. So we'll end up with 650 super councillors in the House of Commons, which I'm not convinced would be great news for Britain. But yeah.
I will keep an eye on the French person not getting too smug about the state of our politics. Sophie, you remembered the question.
The transactional voters thing. I mean, I think it is true, and I think, you can get that from the fact party allegiances have declined. You can see that. I think it was some work by Fiscal data actually showed that the number of marginal seats in this election will at least double compared to the last election. So that's a whole lot more seats that parties are going to have to go out and actively fight for at each campaign. I think that can only be a good thing for making sure that voters do feel like people pay attention to them and are interested, in what they've got to say. But the only caveat I would really make to that is to say, actually, that kind of de-alignment, that's not something that has just suddenly happened over the last few years. If you look at the reason why the Red Wall was called, why that term was kind of generated, it was because so many of those seats, it made no sense that they were so strongly Labour voting as they were for such a long period of time, in terms of, their economic values maybe, but their social preferences, how kind of their diversity compared to the diversity of seats like London, the affluent, all these kinds of things. It made no sense why these communities voted Labour for so long. So it was always going to fall apart at some point. And maybe Brexit sped it up, I don't know. But, there should never have really been that allegiance. And I think all this kind of, globalisation, I think the pandemic, Brexit, the importance of cultural values to our politics now, all of that just means that there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore, I don't think.
No, I agree. I mean, before I come back to Rob, I'll tell you my favourite story of the last 5 years. I grew up in Wakefield, which had that by-election towards the end of Boris Johnson. And Wakefield is one of those seats where basically the Conservatives didn't bother in the 70s. Labour were always going to win Wakefield. And I remember going to a reception just before the by-election and meeting the Japanese ambassador. And the Japanese ambassador said to me, unprompted, I'm incredibly interested by what's happening in Wakefield. And it suddenly dawned on me at that moment that, if you want to get noticed, become a marginal, because bloody hell, the Japanese ambassador, lines you never thought you'd hear in your whole life, the Japanese ambassador is worrying about Wakefield. So there's quite a bit of truth to that. But Rob?
Well, the super councillor's point, I mean, if you watch Prime Minister's questions every week, as I do, it's just been this long sort of, for 5 years, it's been sort of Tory MPs from seats that Tories have not traditionally held, standing up and saying, would the Prime Minister like to say that it would be great if we could have a new hospital wing, essentially, and different Prime Ministers to different degrees saying it would. And yes, which is, at one level it's great, and it's great that they're paying attention. It's not, strictly speaking, sort of the job of MPs to be getting hospitals built in there. It's their job to be getting hospitals built, full stop, if you see what I mean, rather than to be arguing about which side of a constituency boundary they should be built on. And so it will be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, I don't know if Hannah White's here. She's struggling here from a Ryanair flight, which I think has been delayed, but she will be here in a minute. But I think one of the really interesting things about our politics, I don't know what you think about this, David, is MPs seem less and less interested in legislating and scrutiny and the jobs that we used to expect them to do, and spend more and more of their time, as sort of Marie alluded to, being glorified local mayors and bringing stuff home for the constituency, and that's affecting the way our politics works.
Yeah, let's let that intersect with the, if you like, one of the biggest long-term tasks of the next Labour government, which we will judge them by, which is reform of the planning laws. So almost everybody who talks about economic growth and says this is the way in which you have to kind of think about promoting economic growth says you have to reform the planning laws. Everything that we have just said talks about the impediments to changing the planning laws. The MP saying my A&E's got to stay, or the MP saying I've got to represent the... We all know, God alone knows, I know from my kind of okay, the inventiveness of the English in particular in getting things stopped as to getting things made is absolutely extraordinary. You've all had campaigns locally, etc. It's absolutely brilliant, the arguments that people come up with. And there's always a local lawyer, etc., who's going to kind of throw the services in for free to kind of stop, you know, whatever. There will always be a complaint that's going to lead to more traffic, so you get the lefties on board, etc., and so on. So that reform of the planning laws, a first order. Now, Labour promised it. So one of the things that will be very interesting straight away is whether or not they're going to do it. And if they do, that will force Labour MPs very quickly out of that position that we've just been talking about, or there will be a very, very early series of major problems.
Was I naive and or cynical in just assuming they were going to build loads of houses in Tory and Lib Dem seats?
There aren't going to be any Tory.
Well, be some.
You need to build them. You look at the MRP maps. You need to build them in the southeast of England. It's going red, and yeah. I mean, if I were Labour, I would be moving that through really fast before all these new MPs representing. Yeah. Where were we this week? Banbury, Bicester. Beautiful, gorgeous parts of the country, and just like
just houses,
concrete them over before those MPs have worked out where their offices are. Would be my advice.
It's not just houses, though. I mean, if you think about the plans to try and bring the cables in from the offshore wind farms, etc., and the incredible campaigns which local Greens, etc., will launch against those, you've got to knock those down too. Yeah. You've got to tell them, well, you had the pylons and you lived with those, and now you're going to live with these, because we've got to get them built, because otherwise we're not going to have the power. And we're certainly not going to have it at the sorts of prices you want.
I mean, we seem to have a country that was designed for onshore wind, and we make it as hard as possible to build it, which is weird to say the best. But let's do what we were meant to do very quickly and talk about the campaign. I can't move for people telling me it was boring. I don't understand why. I think it's been fantastic.
What did they want? What did they want?
Yeah, I know.
The Prime Minister delivered announced it in the rain.
I mean,
punched a veteran on D-Day. I mean, what did they want him to do?
So Rob's job has been very easy during the campaign, it turns out. Go on, you've been around everywhere, haven't you?
I have, but I found it headed. Well, in that basically, it's been half. So I think it's been funny but not fun, is how I would describe it. No, so it's been great from the Tory side, because every Conservative has been happy to kind of like bitch about whatever's going on and the person next door, etc. Labour just presented a completely united front. So I think you did read about my newsletter for the newspaper. After the manifestos came out, I was tasked with kind of, asking party insiders what they made of the manifesto, any good sides, bad sides. Tories, I just got a kind of, avalanche of special advisors going, awful, we're all going to die, etc., etc. Labour, and genuinely, and I wish I were making it up, I messaged lots of people, 3 separate people replied in total, it's good. What do you want me to do with that? So I think it has been definitely occasionally funny, but yeah, on the reporting side of things, Labour has just been so tightly kind of, held together that it's been really hard. Basically, so really hard covering an election where we know exactly who's going to win, but the people who are about to win do not want to talk to you, so you just focus on the people losing anyway. So yeah, it's been weird. It's been weird.
Yeah, I mean, all through the last 4 or 5 years, I've been saying, I really ought to write more about Labour, but every time you sort of say, today's the day, going to go and sketch, Johnny Reynolds or something, and then there would be a Tory disaster, and it's like, okay, fair enough, lads. They are the attention-seeking child in the garden, And actually that's continued into the, because I thought this week, have I sketched Keir? And then I know I went to the manifesto launch, I must have sketched Keir at least once during so I went to do him again, and I went to do him in Banbury or Bicester, but it was Banbury. And the thing I found myself sketching actually was this incredible machine of, there's an advanced team, and we got there early, and so we got to watch them all setting up, and you're going to be interviewing him. Are you on camera? Okay, well, he's going to sit here, you're going to sit there, I'm going to photograph you, I'm going to photograph where he's going to be, and then we're going to look at these photographs, and do we have the right background? Is there anything stupid? Is this sending the message we want to send? It was hard to sketch, but a joy to watch, just to watch people performing at the top of their game. And then, the following evening we go to the National Army Museum for the sort of penultimate Rishi rally, where, what are the jokes about Rishi? Well, he goes everywhere in a helicopter. Can we have him giving the speech underneath the helicopter? Would that? Can we actually get a huge helicopter? Yeah, I found one. I found one. He can stand underneath and speak. The sound didn't work. The whole having Boris there thing, but they're there, but they're not speaking. So there's sort of a completely different level of operation.
What have you made of it?
I don't like campaigns, election campaigns, and unlike David Willetts, I think they're always rubbish. I think one advantage of being as old as David Willetts is not only do I remember the things that he remembers, I remember the things he appears to have forgotten. like Labour's double whammy, do you remember that one? And so on, and other things, and how it was all Labour's fault in 2010 that we'd had a subprime crisis, and other kind of things which the Conservative Party did, and Labour returned the credit. So I don't like campaigns, and they are the moment when politicians cannot possibly tell you what they think. It's impossible. They have got to be incredibly disciplined, unless they know they're going to lose, and in which case they do what Suella Braverman did. And so on. My absolute favourite moment, therefore, is Nigel Farage on that stage when somebody lets the picture of Putin come. Firstly, this is a moment of total truth. It's a moment of total truth, which everybody really should kind of reflect upon, etc. The second thing is that a really good politician makes light of it, has a bit of repartee. What does Nigel Farage do? He says somebody at the Columbine Centre is going to get the sack. Charming, you thought, well, okay, well, that gives us a fair kind of idea about his personality. So in a sense, if you like kind of moments which epitomise particular personalities and moments, then that would be it. Otherwise, the real fun is tonight. The real fun is tonight. For me, it's the numbers. It's the constituency names. It's the places you've never been, the names of people. What I love about tonight is the possibility that people will get elected who really didn't want to be MP. and people will remember that poor doctor in Wimbledon in 1997 who had a lovely practice and he really enjoyed it, and somebody said to him, Roger, go and stand in Wimbledon, etc. You make a kind of fist of it, we'll never win. And he won. It was an absolute catastrophe for him.
I mean, the serious side of that, I suppose, is when you have snap elections and unexpectedly big majorities, due diligence hasn't been carried out on all the candidates, as we saw in both 2017 and 2019. But Sophie, you're not as old as David. I'm hoping you're not as cynical about campaigns as David. What have you thought of it?
I feel like working in politics just speeds the process up. So I feel like I'm beyond my years in political cynicism. I think for this campaign, I think the reason why it's felt so boring is not even necessarily because I think it was any less eventful or more eventful than your standard campaign. I just feel like everything was so low stakes. Even the gaffes were really low stakes. He's put a bet on, but it was only for 200 quid. If you're going to do it, throw £1,000 on, do you know what I mean? Go all out, why not? Use someone else's debit card, don't use your own. I just feel you know what I mean? It's just felt so kind of from the start, we kind of know what's going to happen. And actually the debate pretty straight away shifted from, who's going to win to how big's the majority going to be. And for a normal person interested in politics anyway, as normal as that person can be, that's not that interesting in a conversation. All they really bothers about is who's the Prime Minister. All right, great, I'm going to crack on and do something else for a few weeks then. So I just think, nothing's felt like it was really going to impact the overall result. And I think that's why it's felt dull. And, the party leaders aren't exactly entertainers, are they? But that aside, I just don't think it's been a very full-on campaign, really.
Okay, so your takeaway message is if you're going to be corrupt, do it at scale.
Yeah. Do you know, like, honestly,
when I worked at Bloomberg, which was I did for a long time, every so often a new executive editor would arrive from America and say, "We're going to dig into the numbers of this. You know, this is what we're going to do." And I would sit them down and I would show them the actual numbers of the cost of British general election campaign, which are sort of what you pay to run in Montana or something. It's basically the whole lot, and they'd stare at it for a bit and then they'd go away, and I'd never hear this idea again.
Has the campaign made the blindest bit of difference?
I mean, I think if you look at the polls in terms of national vote intention, it doesn't really look like it. I mean, gone up and down very slight numbers for the main two parties, but actually I think a lot of the interesting stuff's been going on kind of underneath the surface of that. So say like when Farage returned to the campaign, the number of 2019 Conservatives saying they'll vote reform went up by about 5%. It's not increased that much since then, but you know, it did go up. Another big thing, Lib Dem voters and Labour voters have become more likely over the course of the campaign to say they'll vote for each other's candidate if it means getting a Tory out. So like all these sort of things have been going on that don't really register at like national opinion poll level, even necessarily in, you know, MRPs or anything like that, but they have made a difference. It's just, you know, as it dented Labour's majority, probably not very much.
And is it fair to think of the Lib Dems, I mean, it strikes me the Lib Dems now are a bit like what we've just heard about the Tories and the Red Wall. That's to say, even though they lost MPs in 2019, they came second in a hell of a lot of places that none of us gave any attention to at all. But all of a sudden, those second places are now the places where they're looking to win.
Yeah, and I mean, Lib Dems, you know, when they go all out in these council elections, they know what they're doing. They do it on purpose because it gets them a really strong local activist base of support that they can mobilise super quickly at a general election, particularly in places where they've come second. And if you look at where I've had the joy of tracking where Ed Davies been going for the last 6 weeks, so I know all of his movements from like to the start of the general election campaign. I reckon, I mean, not all of them, but most of them, the public ones. And and when you look at where he's been visiting, it's super targeted. It's places where the Lib Dems came second. They need less than a 20% swing to take it off the Tories. Most of them have got an issue with, you know, water pollution or sewage or stuff like that, and they're just on it. They've gone places where they know they can win, and they've been very efficient with the resources. And I think that's the difference from 2019, is that they've just mobilised themselves way better.
Well,
on the Lib Dems,
you have to put your hand up. It's fine.
I'm polite, sue me. No, so on the Lib Dems, I do think they kind of will be the mystery box of the next Parliament, because they did the really clever things, you know, when we had the 1 million by-elections under Boris and Liz Truss, and to an extent Rishi Sunak. The Lib Dems gained quite a few seats, and obviously the Lib Dems, what they're good at is doing the hyper-localised kind of, you know, focus on very local issues, nearly apolitical in a way, kind of like by-election campaigns. So did that, gained a bunch of MPs. Then we had the general election campaign where Ed Davey just did stuff, is how I would describe it. I feel like he kind of went around the country doing stuff, and there wasn't, I think, a tremendous amount of scrutiny from on the press side. It was mostly kind of, you know, city pictures of Ed Davey and the occasional interview about his personal life, but that was that. So when they actually arrive in Parliament and become a force to be reckoned with again for the first time since 2015, what are they going to do? There's going to be so many new MPs, and it's not entirely clear to me what the Lib Dems actually stand for, like this iteration of the Lib Dems. So I think, yeah, I'll be quite curious to see what they actually want to do. Because, again, no one's really asked them.
I mean, something I have not quite figured out, I don't know if any of you have got the answer, is whether the Lib Dems will oppose Labour from the left or from the right.
They'll oppose it from the left.
I think it depends on the issue.
Yeah, they have to do it from the left. There's no...
There's not a gaping big
hole.
I
don't think there's any...
If you're the MP for Cheshire...
Laurie's shaking his head at me. Laurie Freedman's shaking his head at me. So
Laurie's on the next panel.
Yeah, I know. On the next panel, I'm going to get...
Because I don't know that's obvious. If you are the... Because the places where the fights are now, there's a vicious battle going on, even now, in Beaconsfield, about whether people should be voting, it's probably over now actually, about whether people should be voting Labour or Lib Dem to get rid of Joy Morrissey, the Tory. If somehow, I suspect that she is going to be the beneficiary of that, but if you are the Lib Dem MP for Beaconsfield, how are you, you know, opposing a reasonably actually left-wing government from the left? So planning. Okay.
But also the Tories are about to go insane and probably go further to the right. So there's going to be a great big gaping hole, I think, in the centre right. So I think the Orange Book is back.
I think Labour can probably fill that. Some of the gaping hole on the centre right. I mean, that's conceivable. No, I mean there is precisely going to be that, and you put your finger absolutely, and the earlier panellists did as well. That the other big contingent question after what's Labour actually going to do, which is by far and away the biggest question. I mean, tomorrow afternoon the cabinet will start being appointed, and some of these things will start. And we heard earlier what will begin to happen. And some of this will just seem for the birds. By the way, my guess about the difference the campaign will have made is it will have depressed Labour's national share of the vote.
Well, it seems the overall vote share of the two big parties is going to be very
but of Labour's, and it will have done it because everybody expects it to win. I mean, it's just so many anecdotes piled upon each other, kind of suggesting that. But the other point was obviously there's going to be a new Tory leader. There's going to be a new leadership, and the big question is whether or not there is such a thing as a Tory moderate fight back. Whether they actually do it, and whether they do to the far right and the right wingers what Starmer eventually had to do to the Corbynites. And I don't see it at the moment.
Don't most moderate Tories do podcasts now or things? Rather than, I mean, haven't they?
Yes. I mean, one of the great things about Substance, as you mentioned earlier, etc., is that they're a great way of monetising very small groups of people who you then think represent much larger groups of people.
But it's not necessarily the case that everyone's subscribers are paying. I'd like to make that point very clear.
I know it.
But look, just on this, I mean, you said Labour can occupy this space. Now, Tim Shipman... No, but it's interesting. I mean, Tim Shipman was out today he used the squatting toad analogy about Boris Johnson after Boris Johnson. He said Boris Johnson is squatting like a toad over the whole of British politics. But isn't one of the lessons we've learned is if you're too broad a toad, you start. This isn't going to work. If you try, all right, forget the toad. If you try and encapsulate too much of the ideological spectrum, it'll all start to fall apart.
Honestly, I wonder why we're talking about ideological spectrums in quite that way. I mean,
I'm very old-fashioned.
The thing that I'm trying to do at the moment in Substack is a kind of definition, if you like, which pins down what we mean by far right, for example, because some of these terms are incredibly elastic. There is a kind of significant ideological difference. But I don't think you'll find that what the Labour government is thinking about much is ideological at all. And frankly, we don't need it. We have... I do this programme for the BBC, and the next panel you've got on after is composed entirely of people who come on it. In other words, people who actually know what they're talking about, and so on. And the head of Radio 4 likes me to come to a one-line conclusion at the end. And the one-line conclusion you can come to almost anything to do with Britain, any policy, is why don't we start thinking about the long term? Why don't we do something about the long term? It's every week you practically say that.
But isn't the very simple answer to that because politics? And actually, I mean, sometimes thinking and wanting public policy to be rational is to wish away democratic politics.
You have to make that your politics. That is the politics that you have to make. You have to say that is the politics that we've got to look to. Yes, that means, I mean, a lot of these things are to do with things like social justice, etc., and the things that you want to be able to afford and things that you want to be able to do. But in the end, everybody, I think the British people understand you can't do those things unless you have the capability to do them and you put them in the right order. That's what you've got to say.
Go on. On the long-term thing, briefly, I was quite interested in, I think it was a briefing from Lotto in a newspaper last week, who said that their ambition is to basically not have a major reshuffle in the entire first 5-year term, which, I mean, I call bullshit on entirely, that's not going to happen. I put all the money I have in my account on that not happening. But
so
I thought there was... But I did think that was actually quite an interesting clue as to how they're going to govern. It is quite an interesting ambition to say we want to have as few sort of different ministers as possible. So it may be, if one decided to be optimistic, a sign that they are thinking about the long term and the kind of stability in politics, a thing we've not had for some time.
I mean, I get that. I was listening to Louise when she was on a second ago saying, I would personally rather politicians were honest and said, I'd love to do this, but I can't because we haven't got the cash. I mean, I wonder if the electorate as a whole is that forgiving or that into honesty. I mean, I think it's quite hard to be that blunt and straightforward and get elected, isn't it? Am I being too cynical?
The interesting thing, one of the interesting thing about watching Starmer in this campaign is that he's not a sound bites man. No. So you know, the first debate when he had to give every answer in 45 seconds, he's still clearing his throat after 45 seconds. Whereas actually with the Sun sort of not debate competition, very few people watched it. So, but what was interesting about that was actually we got the first good answer to the question, "Tell us about you and Jeremy Corbyn." Because he had time and space to develop it, and he basically said, look, every Labour MP faced a problem, and people dealt with it in different ways, and none of us are very happy with ourselves. And listening to that, you thought, right, okay, you have explained that you were in a difficult situation, and you had to do a difficult thing where none of the choices were good. And he can do that, but actually it was interesting that we were sort of 4 weeks into a campaign. It was really the first time that he'd had a chance to / been forced to, both somebody just sitting on that question, but also giving him the space to sort of talk us through this. And the trouble is, so much of politics is, you know, so much of this campaign has been, £2,000 or this or that, you know, and Rwanda, and not a kind of, right, let's just explore why, you know, vast numbers of people are moving around the world at the moment, and what realistically you can do if you want to stop them moving to you, and whether in fact you do want to stop them moving to you. That's not the kind of debate that we have, certainly in elections.
Yeah. No, that's true. Actually, I want to ask one question about the future. I just want to check, Bobby, can we take questions from the audience? Is there a mic? So I'm going to come to you in a minute. We've got about 10, 15 minutes left. But there's one question I just wanted to ask to sort of round this bit off, which is, are you optimistic about a new Labour government? I mean, we actually seem to be saying these people seem sensible, these people aren't going to be playing musical chairs with cabinet posts, these people seem rational, they seem to have plans. So is it all going to get better?
Somewhat. Yeah, can I say things are going to get somewhat better?
Well, you can, I suppose, yeah. Okay. Would you like to elaborate?
Oh, yeah, but I guess I'm just like moderately optimistic, I suspect. I don't know, but again, you know, that being said, I found it really interesting looking back at the 97 campaign, you know, the famous, you know, was it like New Labour pledge card, which everyone still talks about a lot. And actually, when you read it, it's incredibly boring. I think one of the pledges, I think, make sure that all classes of 6 and 7 year olds have a maximum of 30 pupils. Like, out of like 5, I think, is like pledges. So again, you know, and obviously, and then the New Labour government did end up doing a lot. So I try and cling on to stuff like that and think maybe, you know, it'll be all flashes and confetti and glitter for 10 years and Britain will enter a new era of glory. But yeah, I don't know. It's also quite hard to get hyped up.
I mean, I think it comes with the caveat as well of how big the majority is. I mean, the bigger the majority, the more you can afford to annoy a few voters and not win their votes back the next time by taking that bit more radical action. Because, like, just as we were talking about, you know, Boris Johnson had this really broad coalition, Keir Starmer's going to have exactly the same issue. I mean, in a way, winning so many seats from so many different parts of the country is a bit of a curse, because you've got exactly the same issue. You've got voters who have completely different preferences, and you're never going to satisfy them all. If you can afford to lose a few of those constituencies next time around, then, you know, you can afford to take that bit more radical.
Sorry, that's such an important point, because although Boris had a wide coalition, he had actually quite a small majority, which meant that at any given moment, 30 Tory MPs are rebelling about something. Yeah. He never really had a majority at all, in a strange kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, the whole Socialist campaign group could rebel, and he's like, okay, great, I need to not to worry about it, and that's a luxury that, you know, another Labour leader or, you know, Boris Johnson never had. So.
Well, the factions will start, won't they?
I mean, it's the Labour Party, of course.
Yeah.
It's not. Like, no one hates the Labour Party more than people in the Labour Party. Like, they all argue with each other constantly. So, I mean, they will, but, I mean, realistically, I think if you're elected under such an unpopular government and you take over from them, I think, don't get me wrong, I don't think they're going to have a massive honeymoon period, but I think you get almost a honeymoon period within the PLP where you have at least a bit of control, because you've got the mandate of, I won us this massive majority, you know, I was elected on this platform, we've got to implement it. And I think you get that bit of kind of stamp of authority. I mean, if you look at Blair, it was kind of post-2001 where I think things started unravelling. He did at least have that initial few years, I think.
He did lose 3 million votes in 2001.
But he could afford to.
Sorry, go on.
No, Blair himself says that he did all his best work after 2005, which he'd won on an election, a majority of 50, but on 36% of the vote.
Yeah.
None of these things are laws, etc. But the one thing that is pretty much a law is that the Prime Minister has total patronage and control over jobs.
Yeah.
And if you want to actually be a minister, you think that's in your stars, particularly at the beginning, you're going to do the right thing by the party, which is what the whips say, essentially, for the first 3 or 4 years, unless you really think you're going to be out on your arse at the next election. And even then, you know, there are other seats you could stand for. I mean, so the problem is that the first period is the most difficult period to do the big things you have to do, but it's also the best period to do the big things you have to do. I know that David and Louise agree with that, but it makes kind of logical sense. So we will actually know relatively quickly, and I don't mean by that in a week, I mean by that within about 18 months.
Yeah, politics is going to slow down a little bit, isn't it, from what it's been.
Except for the Tories, and we'll all look at the Tories. As soon as they start having one of their, Bob's absolutely right, you know, kind of the spoilt child, etc. We'll look at whatever. I mean, Suella Braverman already began it, even before the election, which I think probably is done for her, because she's not really supposed to do that, but then actually old rules don't apply anymore, so.
We're all going to have to get used to not really having to bother what the ERG thinks anymore, which is going to be...
Yeah.
Exactly. So we're going to take a few questions from the audience now. We're going to try and finish about 20 past. Can you just... And can I just say that if Rob Hutton leaves, it's not because your question's rubbish, it's because he's got to leave on the dot. Of course of us.
Yeah.
All right.
That's fine, I'll try and make it a really fascinating question. Actually, it's going to be a leading question because that's what people do when they ask questions from the floor. We've heard Baroness Casey talking about the need for consensus politics and a need for a more grown-up approach to things and telling people where there are trade-offs and where things can't just be solved immediately. And also, David, you just said about the summing up line on Radio 4 being everything needs to be more long-term. Do you think that there is a space in this new government for a more mature approach to getting citizens involved in some of those in-between election big challenges? And my dog in the fight here is that I work for a public participation charity, and we promote things like citizens' assemblies and panels and all of that kind of stuff. I think we see that there's a really big opportunity, and I would be really interested in what the panel think are the sort of potential areas and the problems with that.
Okay, so citizen participation and Will, right at the back. I'm blind as a bat, so it's completely random whose hand I see, I'm afraid.
At least you see hands.
On a slightly miserable note, I've spent my adult political life in what now appears to be a lull in great power conflicts, but there is a war on, and you'd be a brave person to guarantee that the UK won't be directly involved in a major war in the next 10 years. And it's interesting that that really hasn't come up very much in these entertaining and expert panels. Just wondered if you have any reflections on that. Are we focusing too much on our domestic political debate? Should we be thinking about the UK's context differently than we maybe have in the last few years?
Right, who wants to answer that second question, knowing that Laurie Friedman's on the next panel?
I mean, I'll have a crack at it. I'm technically a military historian. Yeah, well, we haven't. We haven't for political election reasons that Labour is keen to shut it down because the Tories are trying to talk it up, really, and also because, in fact, I don't think there is a massive policy difference on the specific Ukraine question. And on the wider Rishi Sunak's, I'm terribly interested in security these days. The problem with it is it's sort of I've been interested in security since after the budget when we didn't do anything about it. You know, I'm so interested in defence that I put Grant Shapps in as Secretary of State for Defence. So in a sense, I think he's not interested in it, and actually it may be that it's one of the areas that gets more attention because John Healey is interested in it, and because even if whatever Starmer's sort of personal instincts, Starmer can see that this is politically something that he has to be interested in. And also, to be honest, I suspect that 6 hours after you've been sat down in number 10 and they've shown you the really horrible secret intelligence, you start thinking that, bloody hell, we really need to do something about this.
No, I'm partly going to be part of the problem and look at it through a Westminster lens, because that's what I know. But I think I completely agree. I think John Healey was a really interesting appointment as Shadow Defence, because he's not the kind of like flashiest MP you could have appointed to that brief. He's not really known outside of the really tight Westminster bubble, but he's also, I think, genuinely liked and respected by everyone. I've never heard a bad word against him. So I think having someone like that in a job like this means that you're probably serious about it. And then so foreign policy as well, I think, so David Lammy, who I interviewed a few weeks ago, read Foreign Policy soon to see the interview, but was, I think, also an interesting appointment. He was not the most obvious person in the world, but then when you talk to him and you talk to people around him, I think the thinking was that Lammy is this incredibly well-connected person around the world, weirdly, and he spent the past 2.5 years effectively just travelling, making every single friend, introducing Keir Starmer as well to lots of people, Obama being famously one of them, but lots of the kind of world leaders and parties, etc. So that's clearly, these are clearly appointments Keir made because he cares about those briefs. I would say that, again, I'm not, I'm the opposite of a war historian, I guess. But I would say, at least in terms of like Starmer's priorities, it does look at least like, it's something he will be taking seriously.
I mean, you can take the foreign policy question, or you can take the Citizens' Assembly, deliberative democracy.
Just take the foreign policy question, the American election is so much more important for determining what happens in this field, in a sense that I feel kind of so overwhelmed by it and by the implications of a Trump return. And as if that wasn't bad enough, we've got to look to see what happens in the French parliamentary elections. If it now seems likely the Rassemblement National don't get a majority, they say they won't form the government, which means they probably won't quite be able to block Macron's spending plans for Ukraine. So that might be a good bit. That's what you have to hope for, by the way. And if you want to know what to hope for there, that's the best probably that we can do. The American situation is so much bigger. And I think I absolutely agree. There hasn't been a distinction between the major parties, which is why Farage is such an outrider. But there is, on the sections of the Conservative right, there is the potential for a change on that. I don't think it will happen, because I think Britain configures itself and just thinks of itself in a completely different way to the way these other countries do. So my feeling is that there will be the will across the political parties to do something towards what is necessary to meet the kinds of problems you're talking about. But obviously, if Trump's elected, what we're talking about is a massive assumption of responsibility by European powers and others for what is an incredibly expensive war which we cannot afford to lose.
Am I with Democratic?
You can do the deliberative.
Okay, I'll do that one. I mean, I think after the referendum, governments are terrified of getting the public involved. We want to keep them at arm's length and only let them participate when they really have to, i.e. elections. So, I mean, I can't really see anything. I mean, partly for that, but also just partly because I can't see Labour having to deal with anything that's so politically sensitive that you have to employ methods like, citizens' assemblies and more like deliberative methods. I just can't see them taking on anything that's so politically sensitive that they have to use something like that. Yeah, I mean, that's probably my not very good answer to that.
If I could just add a quick moan about that. I mean, lots of politicians through the Brexit period were calling for a citizens' assembly, and I remember talking to loads of them, and it was so bloody irritating because they'd say things like, we should have a citizens' assembly to decide that we need to rejoin. And they're like, well, no, that's not how it works. You have a citizens' assembly to figure out what they think and to do what they say, not to rig it to get the answer you want. So I think sometimes these things are instrumentalised in a really unhelpful, which isn't to say they're a bad idea, because we've seen in numerous contexts, not least in Ireland, that they can be really useful. But here sometimes I just think, like everything, politics takes over and they just get sort of subsumed in the political game. Did you want to add anything on the deliberative? You don't have to. I'm not picking on you. We've probably got time for one more. Gentleman at the front here, very prompt with the hand. If there's anyone else who can squeeze in.
Oh, there's one over there.
Oh, right. Can you both be quite quick, because I'm now getting dirty looks running over that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what the implications of having Sue Gray as Chief of Staff today, but actually somebody who understands how the civil service works before, and she's had time to work with the shadow cabinet, presumably, to actually devise things and make government work better. Is that likely to happen or not?
I'm going to say, with Jill Rutter coming on the panel next, only a fool from this panel would answer that question.
Yes, I want to talk about participation and engagement, because I've come to elections all over the world, and I think that British elections recently are incredibly closed. If you were going to cover an election in Germany, there would be public meetings. You could go on candidates' websites, including party leaders' websites. They would have a timetable for the whole campaign. There would be posters around.
Oh, that's better.
There would be posters. That's better. There would be posters around the town saying when the dates, when somebody coming. Angela Merkel comped was all over the places that she was visiting. There is nothing like this here. The closest that people probably outside this hall get to being involved in the election process is to watch things on television, which are really, that they're made for television. You can't go to those events. You don't even know they're happening until they appear on the evening news.
Can I?
Yeah, you can. And actually, if you want to put some French reflections in, how do the French do it?
I moved here when I was 17, so I don't have the faintest clue. Sorry about that. I sort of disagree, because I do think most seats will have hustings, which sadly I had to attend for reporting reasons this election, and I hated every second I spent at hustings because they're very boring. But I do think that if you really want to get involved, you can probably find some stuff. But yeah, I guess I'm probably in favour in general of more openness. But that being said, I do think that if you talk, and that's quite bleak, sorry, but if you talk to MPs, if you've spoken to MPs over the past few years even, they're just really worried about their security at the moment and their safety, for all the obvious reasons. But I think, when you talk to the number of MPs who say, and who've been in Parliament for a long time, and say, I used to just be able to chat to people, all the time, whereas now I get my local police begging me to basically have a police escort whenever I go anywhere, which is incredibly depressing. So I think that that's probably part of the reason as well why that's not happening. And Sue Gray, to be very brief, I think, yes, that's a good idea. She's someone who really fundamentally understands Whitehall, but also understands Parliament, and very few people can do that. So.
There are hustings in loads and loads of places. The candidates do loads of hustings. And actually, I'm slightly surprised they do, because given the threats that are routinely made against candidates and MPs, etc., I'm not sure I'd do them. You are very, very vulnerable under those circumstances. There are the rallies. That's not the issue. People will turn up to big rallies if they think it's going to be interesting. And you will hold them if you think you will get the people. So Farage has his 4,000 people, and the flares go off, etc., making it look a teeny bit like a kind of cross between, the launch of an Apple product and Nuremberg. So I think these things do. I think these things do happen. But the things also in this country, they happen quite often in very parochial ways. Actually, I remember chairing a husting. I was actually once asked in my constituency when Glenda Jackson was the MP. Chairing Glenda Jackson in a local candidate's hustings was very, very interesting. You kind of wondered who you were getting. Was it Elizabeth R? Etc. But one thing I do remember was whenever she was asked a question, it was her turn, she would bolt up like that. She didn't just kind of stand up, creak up there, bang, like that. It was really scary. I mean, it's like a sort of pop-up, just going like this, boom, and off she'd go. So it was worth saying, but not many people came.
Okay. Last word, Sophia. Do you think our politics are too closed?
I think there are opportunities. I think MPs in the UK take replying to their casework and things incredibly seriously, even when they're candidates, and they can't reply in their parliamentary capacity. So I would say that they're very engaged and they're very aware of the local issues, probably now more than ever. But just the question made me think if there was some really good research, and I can't remember if it was from Salvation or Ipsos, but it was from one of them, and it was basically being like, do you want your MP to engage more with the local area? Yeah, 100%. What do you want? I want hustings, I want community visits, I want this, I want this, I want this. Are you likely to go to them? No, probably not. So, it's kind of, voters are quite difficult to get by with, and that you can put on all this stuff, but the odds are they'd rather stay at home and watch the telly instead of actually coming to speak to you. So,
Brilliant. And remember, if you're going to bet big. Before I ask you to thank our panel, and perhaps you can boo Rob, seeing as he's not here, just for a bit of fun, I have to give you a couple of messages. One, there is a thing where you can do your predictions for the outcome of the exit poll over there. There is also food and drink over there, and I make it we now have 37 minutes until the exit poll. So go eat, drink, be merry, but first, give this lot a round of applause, please. Thank you. Thanks ever so much.
Such a correct background about the size
That was fun, yeah.
I have to say, when you stayed in there,
Yeah, no, it was, yeah.
has been fighting hard to hang on to power after the Tories' 14 years in charge. But can he cross Jeremy Vine's winning line outside number 10?
Every paving stone a parliamentary seat. You remember 2019 when Boris Johnson won all these seats and paved a path to the door of number 10. This time, can Labour turn the blue seats red and send Keir Starmer through that historic black door, or will the Conservatives hold them off?
This is the engine room of our election coverage, where we're keeping an eye on all the election centres right across the UK with an army of reporters. Fiona Bruce and Victoria Derbyshire are with the Labour and Tory leaders. And the race to deliver the first result is always fiercely contested. So we have our earliest risers on the hunt for the early declarers.
Hello, I'm in Blythe, where a recount in 2019 stopped them winning. But this time, this team is even more determined than ever. Do we think we can beat Sunderland this time?
Yes! Well, let's just see, shall we? Sunderland has won this race many, many times, and they're not giving up without a fight.
Here in London's Broadcasting House, our teams are poised, ready to gather and then verify every single result as they begin to come in. And of course, at the heart of it is Professor Sir John Curtis, who's been hard at work already all day with the exit poll team. And in just a few moments, we can legally reveal the results of all of those calculations.
That exit poll will indicate who will be heading here to the Commons, and Rita Chakrabarti will be checking all the numbers.
We're feeding all that data into the giant screen now, and in a few moments' time, I'll be able to tell you which seats are most likely to be changing hands.
If neither Keir Starmer nor Rishi Sunak win the magic 326 seats, could one of the smaller parties back them up? Ed Davey's Liberal Democrats would love to become the third biggest party once again. Nigel Farage is back in frontline politics with Reform UK. And Kirsty Wark is watching the battle in Scotland.
I'm here in Glasgow, where we're expecting a night of high drama, with politicians using the results in Scotland to argue for or against independence. I'll be joined by the country's senior politicians, advisers and commentators to react to the big stories right through the night.
Ready for an avalanche of information and reaction, our political editor, Chris Mason, is with us here in the studio.
So, we're seconds away from 10 o'clock and the exit poll, a first indication of how the night might unfold. More than 20,000 people took part on behalf of the BBC, ITV News and Sky in this first July election since 1945. 326 seats I needed to win. So, here we go.
And as Big Ben strikes 10, the exit poll is predicting a Labour landslide.
Sir Keir Starmer will become Prime Minister with a majority of around 170 seats.
The exit poll predicts that Labour will have captured 410 seats, adding 209. It suggests the Conservatives will have lost 241 MPs, landing on 131.
On to the other numbers. The Liberal Democrats up 53 on 61 seats. Reform on 13 seats. The SNP down 38 seats. According to this exit poll, on 10, Plaid Cymru are on 4, they're up 2, and the Greens are up 1 on 2.
All the pointers tonight are that Sir Keir Starmer is taking Labour back to power. Only the fifth Labour leader to win a general election. These are the first indications of what may unfold, but a moment of history beckons. Chris.
Blimey, just take a look and take in those numbers. The Conservative Party, so often an election-winning machine, looks pulverised tonight, taking in those numbers. At the last general election, it was Labour that was pulverised, reduced to its smallest number of seats since 1935. At the time, there was talk that Boris Johnson might serve as Prime Minister into the 2030s, and that for Labour to win by just a smidgen would require a Himalayan climb on their part. And yet you look at those numbers and they have won by a mile. What does this tell you? It tells us a lot about voter volatility. Like never before, more people in more places, more often, are more willing to change their minds about who they support from one election to another. That's why it looks like we went from a landslide last time for the Conservatives to a landslide for Labour this time. It is going to be quite the night.
And Chris, we should remind viewers there's a high degree of scepticism we should apply to this exit poll. They have a very good track record, but it's only over the next few hours that the results will come in and will tell us the real verdict of the British people. But it does seem, as it has done all the way throughout this campaign, that Sir Keir Starmer has done something extraordinary, pulling back Labour from where it was in 2019.
Astonishing when you look at the Labour numbers, given where they were, given the extent to which they had been so comprehensively beaten last time. There was lots of folk in lots of political parties anticipating that that would mean they'd be out of power for at least a decade. And yet you look at these numbers, and of course we should insert the caveat, shouldn't we? But given the margin of that Labour lead in the exit poll, there is plenty of scope for that to be out by a reasonable margin and Labour still to be heading for a very sizable, historically big majority. Where we should insert a few more caveats, shouldn't we, is around some of the smaller parties, not least the Scottish National Party, by dint of the SNP merely standing in Scotland. There are fewer data entry points into that exit poll, so there's a bit more caution around that. Similarly around reform as well. So some things to sort of mark our card in terms of caveats, but in terms of the big story, it looks very clear, and we overuse words like historic, don't we, occasionally in journalism. I'll plead guilty to that, but these numbers, if they are broadly in line with where we find ourselves by breakfast time, warrant that label.
Yeah, historic, seismic.
Yeah.
What a shift in the political tectonic plates. No question that the polls have been all over the place in terms of measuring the size of a potential Labour majority. But if this exit poll, for early indication, if it is right, we're talking about potentially Labour being in power into the 2030s.
Well, or not, because who knows if the equal and opposite might happen at that
Exactly.
at a next election. And the recent electoral history tells you that things can swing in all sorts of directions remarkably quickly. But to answer your question the other way, if you like, Clive, if you're a Conservative tonight absorbing these numbers, clearly they are bleak and point to a long, long way back if that's how the numbers stack up as the hours come. You know, the number of Conservative seats worst in a century, Labour broadly similar in terms of where they are majority-wise and indeed seats-wise, according to the exit poll, from 1997. So to just give you some sort of historical metric, that's the zone we're in.
OK, Chris, thank you. We're going to be getting much more from you throughout the night, of course.
We will, and through the night we'll be joined by a parade of political guests. Some of them will be in jubilation. Some of them will be very much at the other end of the scale. We're joined initially by Lord Mandelson, who is, of course, one
already,
of the architects of the 1997 New Labour victory, and Steve Baker, the Conservative, who doesn't know yet whether or not he has held on to his seat in Wickham. And we will come to them in just a couple of minutes. But I want to remind you of these numbers as they have been revealed by the exit poll, showing Labour on 410 seats, having gained 209. The Conservatives crashing down to 131, losing 241. 61, the Liberal Democrats, an incredible performance for them if they are correct, on 53 seats. The SNP crashing down to 10, Plaid Cymru gaining 2, the Greens gaining 1, and the Reform Party gaining 13. You can just about see them coming onto the glorious prow of Broadcasting House here in the heart of London. But as Chris was saying, particularly when it comes to the smaller parties, we will insert lots of grains of salt at this stage. Small errors, small margins of errors in the exit poll could end up with very, very different tallies for them by the end of the night. So bear that in mind.
Yeah, health warnings will be the order of the night until we start getting the real results coming in. Hopefully the first result, possibly in the next hour and a half. Who knows? Fingers crossed. We'll be able to get that to you. Of course, if you're going to have a majority to Labour, according to the exit poll of 170, then that means a number of Labour gains, quite clearly. Right around the country, we're going to have a look at some of those that our psephologists suggest could be changing hands to Labour with a 95% level of certainty. Swindon South, Darlington, Rutherglen from the SNP. We already had the exit poll suggest the situation in Scotland there. Wrexham, Conservative, now potentially gone, according to our exit poll. Leon Atherton, Middlesbrough, Swindon North as well. And it's going to be very, very interesting indeed.
Well, let's go straight to one of the people who it looks like is heading for government. Angela Rayner is with us tonight from Ashton-under-Lyne. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Do you believe these numbers, Angela Rayner?
Well, the numbers are encouraging, but of course the exit poll is a poll, so we haven't had any results yet. I think Keir Starmer has done a tremendous job of transforming the Labour Party and putting forward a programme for government that I'm hopeful that people have got behind.
The numbers are a bit more than encouraging, though, for the Labour Party. I mean, you will have had thousands of activists out on the stump today, banging on doors, doing their own research with their clipboards, getting busy. Do your numbers at Labour HQ broadly match with what we've seen tonight?
Well, if you look at where we were in 2019, just to get a majority of one,
I can't put it better than Chris Mason, who said blimey at that. So for some more considered political reaction to the exit poll and the challenges facing the new government, I'd like to welcome the next panel to the stage. Thank you so much.
I think we'll... Hannah, do you want to go next to Laurie? And I'll go in the middle and... Oh, Laurie gone in. So you need to lean into these microphones. Okay, I need to lean in. Yeah, I don't. Oh, very good. I should
Hello, everybody. And it looks like the decision to change from the blue dress to the red dress is vindicated, which I had to take with 5 minutes to go. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a senior fellow at UK and a Changing Europe here at King's College London, and also a senior fellow at the Institute for Government. And now, thank goodness, we're almost getting to the stage where we can stop talking about polls and actually start talking about what really matters, which is how we might be governed for the next 5 years or so. But we are going to talk a little bit about polls, don't worry, because I could hardly not do that, with my first panellist, Ben Page, from Ipsos Mori, joined also by Paul Johnson, the man who complained of conspiracy of silence and then went on holiday. Dr. Hannah White, delivered to us courtesy of Rayner, Director of the Institute for Government, and Professor Lawrence Freedman, very, very distinguished member of the faculty here at King's. So we're going to work on the working assumption, as the about to be former Prime Minister might have put it, that Professor Curtis and his teams have got their sums, at least on the big parties, about right, and they've not been overridden by some nervy BBC editor. So we're going to assume, for the purpose of this discussion, that tomorrow, probably between 11 and midday, we will see the transfer of power to a Labour government with quite a big majority. But let's do a little bit about polls. Ben, since you're here, you've seen these numbers. Anything surprising here for the pollsters? And in particular, it's quite interesting looking at that exit poll. That figure for Reform, that figure for the SNP, can exit polls really do the smaller parties?
Well, we'll find out fairly soon. I mean, I think the exit poll has turned out to be pretty good, and over the last few years, particularly on the lead for the major parties. So there's no reason to believe that it won't be. There were some more challenges in terms of changing constituency boundaries this time, but I think overall it's in line with all of the evidence before the election. You'll have seen a lot of MRP polls during this election campaign, but they're all subject to various layers of possible error, because you're applying different statistical techniques across a huge number of constituencies. But broadly, the thing that strikes me here is this is the Conservative Party, the mean, lean, winning machine that has governed this country for most of the last 120 years, and it's just got fewer MPs, if this is even remotely correct, than it lasted in its worst defeat in 1906. So, you know, we were saying they might get about 115 a month ago in our MRP model. This is saying 131, but the previous low was 156. It will only take a few of them now to trigger another leadership campaign. So it sounds like they will have plenty to keep them occupied if this is remotely right. It's also, though, a smaller majority, if it's correct, but you know, the last few have been pretty much on the nail. Than Blair achieved in 97, which I think was 179, so 170 majority. It's not this sort of, I mean, that's a landslide, but it's not this sort of absolute supermajority of over 200 that some extrapolations from polls have been talking about. But no, I think at the moment, it's sort of game on. Reforms seem to have done well, and what I'm going to be fascinated about is parties on the right suddenly saying how unfair our electoral system is when, you know, they get 13 MPs on a larger share of the vote than the Lib Dems, who get 61 and et cetera, et cetera. But no, at the moment, there isn't anything, you know, the large Labour majority that we were expecting has happened.
To be fair to Reform, they have been saying that for some time. It's the Conservatives who may be slightly more unlikely converts to the case for electoral reform, because I don't think we've ever seen them think that the first past the post system is inherently unfair. So what's going to keep you up all night? Well, I mean, other than a million parties to go to?
The vote, I think, obviously, how close there are various different exercises that have just taken place. So the polls are trying to measure the vote share, the percentage vote share achieved by each of the parties, and we have a lovely friendly rivalry amongst each other about who gets it right and all the rest of it. There's lots of bragging rights. Remember, the average error of the polls back in 2019 was 0.6% across all the companies. So I think there'll be a wider variation this time, so we'll see. And of course, then the exit poll, how does that relate to the actual seat share? So those are the sorts of things that will maybe keep me awake for a little bit at night. But I think, to be honest, in terms of the hunting of the pollster and the persecution of the pollster, we said there'd be a Labour majority. There is, unless there's something very strange there, which I have no reason not to think's happened, there will be a large Labour majority.
So pollsters vindicated.
More or less, but somebody will find fault, undoubtedly.
Okay, sound very much as though you've got a complex there, Ben. But anyway, Hannah, tomorrow, transfer of power. I said around midday we get the sort of helicopters and the motorcades and things like that. Do you think Labour's really ready to govern?
Well,
you mean no?
Who is ever ready? I mean, I think obviously Labour have been out of power for 14 years. I think this opposition has worked hard to prepare itself, and the circumstances have been conducive to preparing itself, in that we've had a full parliament nearly. The election was predictable. They saw it coming and saw the possibility of winning far enough out that they could spend time preparing. I think they're relatively unusual in that they have a leader in Keir Starmer and a chief of staff in Sue Gray, both of whom understand the Whitehall machine. We certainly haven't at all recently had a Prime Minister who has been to Wednesday morning colleagues and sort of been a perm sec and sort of understands that part of the machine from the inside in the way that Keir Starmer will. And also, I mean, we did some analysis at IFG to look at the prior experience of previous shadow cabinets coming into government, and compared to 97, this is a more experienced shadow team. So if it transfers into government as is, which, if the exit poll is right, I assume the additional Green seat that's being predicted there is Carla Denyer in Bristol, which would mean that Thangam Debonair wouldn't win her seat, and therefore there'd need to be a different culture secretary. But if otherwise, if otherwise the shadow cabinet come in, they are relatively experienced. But I don't think anyone is ever actually prepared, and government has changed quite a lot. The IFG has done what we always do, which is some work with the opposition to try to explain how government has changed and to help them think through what they would need to do should they win power, as we've done ahead of every election. But yeah, I don't think anyone's ever actually prepared.
Okay, and the precise sort of timings tomorrow, will we get the full cabinet tomorrow? Do we think it's quite likely we'll have a parade up and down Downing Street? Now, government by the end of the weekend?
I
with a
think,
break for the football on Saturday? I'm working then. Yeah, I'm very happy to do that.
What's been briefed out is that the aim would be to do cabinet tomorrow, and the rest of the ministers of state on Saturday, and then with a break for football, and then sort of everything set up by the beginning of next week.
Okay, so government departments can all be humming into action. So, Laurie, one of the things that's really interesting about the timing for this election is that prime ministers, in my experience, are always surprised by how many demands foreign policy makes on their agenda, and Keir Starmer is going to be thrown in the deep end because his first big event will be a trip to the NATO summit in Washington. We assume he will go, and then hosting the European political community on the 18th of July. What sort of, welcome can he expect? I mean, there's lots going on in the rest of the world with President Biden, position, the presidential race being questioned, the French election second round on Sunday. And will actually he say anything different at that NATO summit to what people might have expected to hear from Rishi Sunak?
Probably not, but first it starts tomorrow. It starts tomorrow. He will be getting calls from foreign leaders. They can't be snubbed. This will take up quite a bit of time. He will be asked to sign the letters of last resort. These are the letters to the submarine commanders. So this is the thing. He's just become Prime Minister and he has to contemplate the obliteration of his government.
And the nation.
And the nation. And what do the submarine commanders do under those circumstances? He'll be given briefings and then he'll be pretty tired still, be taking a red eye to Washington, where there will be enormous curiosity about him. He hasn't I mean, David Lammy's been doing the hard rounds, but he hasn't. So there's going to be a lot of side conversations, but there's important business. And it would be very surprising if big changes in policy suddenly emerged there. And they've said on Ukraine that it's continuity. The other thing, given what you mentioned, Jill, is that we've just had a massive vote for a social democrat government. Everybody else is going in the other direction. He is now going to be the most stable political leader in Europe, in the Western world, possibly. It's not just Macron's in trouble. Nobody expects Scholz to survive next year's elections. Trudeau is in trouble. And this is going to create real problems, not particularly because of the ideological questions. It's just that there's going to be an awful lot of inward-looking political leaders around with very little time to spend on the UK and really quite worried about their own situation. So if you want big initiatives, this is probably not the time to do it. And that's relevant to Europe, I mean, because there's von der Leyen's been nominated again. She's still got to go through Parliament, European Parliament. The Commission won't be together till October, the new Commission. It's going to take a while before any progress, if any at all, is going to be made on the various things we'd like to do with the EU. So he's going to find it both very demanding, important, and incredibly frustrating, I expect.
That's really interesting. So one of the things Labour, I think, have said is that they want to do a defence review over the next year. We're looking towards a longer-term spending review as well, and to set budgets for probably for the rest of the Parliament. So what would Labour need to do? Will they do, go and look again at that integrated review
I hope they
that
don't.
did a couple of times? Okay.
I hope they don't, because it was a perfectly good review, the previous one, and the refresh that they had to have because of the invasion of Ukraine. And the decisions have to be taken now. You can't wait. And you're going to have to take big decisions now. They've said particularly defence, and there are issues with defence. And the biggest issue is how you persuade Rachel Reeves to move from 2.3% GDP on defence to 2.5, which there'll be a lot of pressure. That'll be one of the issues that will come up at the NATO summit. I mean, so that if it's narrowly defence, fine. If they try to do it on the whole range of foreign policy, it's a waste of time. There's the Lord Mayor's banquet speech in November. Seems to be a very good time to think, which is always a set-piece foreign policy speech. That's the time they should. If Starmer has developed a foreign policy philosophy by then, he can share it. But I would counsel very strongly against another massive review.
Okay, well, that's one useful piece of advice, taking something slightly off the table. Paul, November is about the time when we might, in a normal timetable, expect a budget, but incoming governments have sometimes liked to move a bit more quickly. What do you think Rachel Reeves should be thinking about when she thinks about the sort of timing of what we very much hope will be a single fiscal event? Is something that the IFS and the Institute for Government have lobbied very hard on. Some might say not desperately successfully, but anyway, got some agreements and commitments in theory. Do you think she'll be aiming to do something in September? What should she be thinking about on that side?
Well, I think she should be looking at a fiscal event in November. That's not just because the September one would ruin my summer holiday.
You've just been on one, Paul.
I need a holiday. Because, unless there is much more that's gone on behind the scenes than I think we're any of us aware of, there's a lot of work to do to get to actually what the first fiscal event would involve. There's no hurry from an economic point of view. There might be from a political point of view, but actually with that size majority, you've got plenty of scope. And I think they really need, on two fronts, the input from the civil service, across the civil service, but also in the Treasury, particularly in the Treasury, and also from any Council of Economic Advisors or whatever that they set up. They're going to need more than a couple of months to really set the agenda for what they want to do. I think there's a big choice, which is, do they have a spending review for 1 year and then really put the time into having one for the rest of the Parliament later next year, or do they try and do it for a 3 or 4 year period straight off? Again, I'm a gradualist. I would say take your time, do it for 1 year, and then work out what you're going to do. But I can see the case for doing everything all at once. Within all of that, then, I mean, the choice is the one that we've been banging on about for the whole campaign, which is they might get lucky. The OBR might come out and say, look, we think the world is much better than we thought under Jeremy Hunt. That would be slightly awkward politically for them to do, but they might. But if they don't get lucky, then they're going to have to make these really tough choices. Are they going to break the really clear statements they've made about sticking to exactly the same fiscal rule as Jeremy Hunt? Or are they going to say, we really are going to cut spending? Or are they going to find some way of raising taxes which don't affect working people? I think I'm a working person. I think, I can't think of a single tax that doesn't affect working people. So, but more seriously, they've said no income tax, no national insurance, no VAT. That's only fools and horses, isn't it? Anyway, so how they're going to square that circle is going to be a really tough one. I mean, I'd be really surprised if they go for the spending cut, a bit of that. So that then leaves the other two options.
That's really interesting. Do you think that there are sort of immediate issues that need to be addressed at all this side of there? I think they're about to get the reports to the public sector pay review bodies. They just do that. They're sort of due to be landing on desks quite soon. We've heard reports that there are some decisions required almost immediately on prisons, where decisions have been delayed during the election. Are there sort of, is there a sort of in-tray of nightmares, I'm going to call it that rather than what Sue Gray allegedly calls it, that ministers will have to confront on day one?
There's a real in-tray of nightmares, and some of them are long-going and some of them are more immediate. I think what you mentioned, public sector pay, that is going to be one of the biggest challenges that they face. I mean, we've had huge pay cuts for the civil service, for teachers, for doctors, for nurses, for large parts of the public service over the last 15 years or so. The unions are going to, it's a Labour government, and of course all of the departments, as someone said earlier, I mean, they move it, they walk up to Downing Street, part of a collective, and they go into the departments, and suddenly they're in their silos, and they're going to be, they're going to be reading lots and lots of stuff. All of these new ministers, which say there are all of these sorts of urgent things, and I think pay is going to be a big issue. Local government and a lot of what's going on in local government is going to be a huge issue. The demands there are enormous. You've mentioned the courts and the prisons. Those are very immediate. I mean, actually, compared with that, in a sense, the sort of long boiling problems of the health service and universities and so on are going to look quite, longer term, oddly enough. I think it's those things which are going to be right at the forefront where there is going to be an urgency to it.
Ben, is there a sort of expectations of governments doing things straight away? Quite a lot of people are sort of comparing this to something that many of us have sort of seared on our memory, which is making the Bank of England independent in week one. Is there a thought that governments have to sort of do something big early? Are voters expecting that?
I think that was very important for economists and people in this room, but for most people, the independence of the Bank of England, it was more received through third parties. I think the bottom line is, look, the NHS was the number one issue in this election. I think that the challenge is that Tony Blair gets elected in '97, huge personal ratings, etc., and people willing to cut some slack. I think the challenge now is politics is in a very different place than in 1997. Keir Starmer is not the same as Tony Blair, and anyway, we don't regard Tony Blair. We could never regard Tony Blair the way we regarded him in '97. It was a special time for whatever reason. So people are going to expect progress, and I think the challenge is, how do you find enough signals of progress? They're going to do 1 million potholes, and the British do love potholes, so maybe they're relatively cheap. So maybe and some more NHS appointments, etc. But I think you need to start seeing some wins quite soon, because of course last time they stuck to Clark's spending plans much longer than Clark expected to, and people were willing to cut them the slack. There were other important devolution in Scotland, etc., etc. This time, I think it's the patience is going to wear thinner much sooner, and you can see, this is an amazing shift if those numbers are anywhere near right from 2019 to now. But you can see another thing where just in 2 or 3 years, Labour is also deeply unpopular if it hasn't managed to show some early wins. So they need to find some money somewhere.
Can I say a little? I don't know if it's the dream that I have, but a sort of, what might be the Bank of England sort of equivalent? Well, Angela Rayner turns up a little commuter village in the commuter belt and says, "This is going to be a new town of 100,000 houses in the next 10 years." That is the sort of big statement.
You see, I never argue with him, and I wouldn't do that. But I think the trouble. I mean, we've seen quite a lot of track record and announcements on those things in the last 20 years, actually. And of course, it's not enough of a national offer. So saying that you're going to build some new houses on bits of the quote unquote the green belt, grey belt, or whatever belt it is, the most sacred thing, I think you've got to do something more that on public service. They notice that somehow it's easy to get an appointment in a hospital.
I'm not disagreeing with that, but actually, that's what Lewis Silkin did in the 1940s in Stevenage, and that's why Stevenage is there. And that is a long-lasting consequence of that degree of radicalism, and that's what Labour Party have been talking about. And it will take that degree of radicalism to make that difference on housing. But it is, you say, you're right, it's gradual, it's long-term in terms of its effect, even if the statement caused chaos.
Paul, you were getting David Aronovich's vote for that announcement, if nobody else is in the room. Hannah, I mean, obviously one of the first things that we get to see, one of the sort of first times the government gets to put out what it really wants to do is in the King's speech, which I think is scheduled for 17th of July, before Keir Starmer goes off to hosts the EPC at Blenheim Palace. What do we think might be in that King's speech? I mean, is it essential that everything's in it? It's quite a big occasion.
So, I mean, obviously the government will want to show that it is hitting the ground running, that it's got some big things that it's going to do, some things which may not necessarily require legislation, but will nonetheless be put forward as bits of legislation because you want to signal that you're doing something important, which sometimes happens. I was going to say the other thing in '97, of course, were the big constitutional changes in the House of Lords and Supreme Court and so on, which happened quickly. But I think we've seen Labour sort of back away from the very sort of radical Brown ideas around the House of Lords. But we might see a bit of that, which is happily not very expensive to do, but might be noticed by some of the members of the public. But yet, what might we see in the King's speech? I think something around the sort of fiscal responsibility stuff that Rachel Reeves has talked about, the ABR, putting in legislation that the ABR has to do analysis of government plans, not something you actually have to legislate for, but would make it harder to undo by a subsequent government. Maybe some stuff on GB Energy, maybe some stuff on train companies and so on, but probably some things which, as you say, the question you asked, does it have to be in the King's Speech? No, not everything that you want to do has to necessarily be in the King's Speech. You can signal also things that you might bring forward as for pre-legislative scrutiny. I would expect probably a government coming in this way to run a long parliamentary session. So they will have time, they will need time to get the legislation that they want drafted and introduced and through Parliament. So they're probably unlikely to run just until May, but for a whole subsequent year, I should think.
So a 2-year session, or it says May 2026?
Close to a 2-year session, I would have thought.
So, Laurie, is there anything that they would need to have in the King's speech from a international? I mean, might they toughen up sanctions or do anything anti-money laundering?
I don't think they need that in the King's speech. I mean, it has to be said that the things that they will need to do will be coming in at them from abroad. I mean, it was mentioned in the previous session, you've got Ukraine, you've got Gaza, and it will be interesting to see when the polls are examined more carefully what effect that's had on the Labour vote. You may have Hezbollah very soon. You've got Sudan, which nobody bothers to talk about, but which is absolutely ghastly. And then, as David mentioned, the far more important election is coming up in November, which doesn't look desperately exciting, or very exciting, but not particularly helpful. If you believe in the Atlantic Alliance and special relationships and so on. So the international agenda sets itself, and Starmer comes in with very little background in this at all. Sue Gray, very little background in this, and they're going to find this is what takes up his time. I mean, David Lammy, you can send off. I mean, there's lots of useful places for him to go. You can send him around the Middle East and try and work out if there's a way of getting some international conference on Gaza or something. But this is head of government stuff, and that's what he's going to have to rely a lot on his ministers to do all the other things.
That's really interesting, because obviously we've seen Rishi Sunak slightly subcontract quite a little of that, because he had a former Prime Minister he prepared earlier to do that, which he just about get away with. But
I mean, it's a different sort of situation, and it's dangerous. I mean, this is a dangerous time, and people will not expect him to say, well, talk to my colleague David Lammy about this. They'll be looking to him to provide lead, and I think the Middle East will be one of his big tests quite early on, because it's very difficult for him to imagine him inviting Prime Minister Netanyahu to London, which his predecessors have all done. Yet if you want to try to get to play a role in some sort of peace process, you've got to talk to the Israelis as well as to say that you want to see a two-state solution, which isn't what's going to happen at the moment. You've got, so it's just the sheer intensity of these crises, their intractability, and you can only do it with coalitions. You can't do it by yourself. And this is why the rather chaotic state of Western political parties at the moment is going to be difficult. Macron would have been a very natural ally for some of this. Macron is totally now sort of managed to shoot himself in the foot in even a more spectacular way in some ways than Sunak. So he's going to be talking to Germany and Poland. It's going to be very different.
Okay, well, let's bring in some questions from the audience. I think we have some roving mics, and I think somebody is going to ask a question that's been asked online. I'm finding it very difficult to see anyone who's asking questions, but I think we have a lady at the back if there's a roving mic. So,
hi, thank you. If you lived in Middlesbrough, would you be singing tonight "Things Will Only Get Better"?
Okay, we don't know how Middlesbrough voted, Ben, on these numbers.
I am not going to go into. I mean, I think. Are you asking about whether the good folk of Middlesbrough are going to benefit from the new government's policies, or what's happened in Middlesbrough? Because on that one, look it up on one of the MRP models, and that will be better than me.
What time did Middlesbrough declare?
On that one, I'm not doing the encyclopedic thing. But, sorry, I now live in Paris for all sorts of strange reasons, which we can talk about.
Definitely talk to you about the French elections.
Yeah, absolutely, it's chaos. But I think the bottom line is how quickly. We've got the one thing that Keir Starmer and his cabinet have on their side is that there are very low expectations. The challenge is when does it become, oh, well, they're just like all the others. The second most likely thing that, and Rachel Reeves, when I've pushed her, has said, I'm saying, what's really going to be different? And of course, sort of energy, but integrity keeps coming. And actually, the British public have bought that. So they say, okay, they'll improve public services and they're going to govern with integrity. So if you're a betting person, and there may be some in this room, when will the first resigning scandal be out of these 400 plus MPs? How many months away is it? I mean, given the nature of the political. But so the question for Middlesbrough is, for the average punter in Middlesbrough is, how soon will things look better? And on that one, I'm not sure.
Well, again, they might get lucky. I mean, they really might. I mean, we've had 15 years of dreadful growth and the worst earnings growth since the Napoleonic Wars and all of that. Yeah. And at some point it will turn round, just like, we had 15, 12 years of zero interest rates and suddenly they're at 5.25%. Yeah. They might just get lucky. Beyond that, I mean, we know that levelling up under this government has gone nowhere.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we might be surprised by, I don't know, is the radicalism of a new government on devolution and levelling up. I mean, we've had the Gordon Brown review. We know that there is stuff in the, if you look at the vibes of the manifesto, there is certainly stuff in there which suggests they might be interested in doing something substantial on devolution. And actually, the other sort of bit of the vibes that you get is that this will be a more economically interventionist government than we've been used to. I mean, there's whatever Great British Energy might be, we don't know, but it's going to be interventionist. There's a sovereign wealth fund. There's significant employment regulation. There's industrial strategy. So, exactly what that will add up to, I don't know, and there are upsides, but there are also risks with something like that. But I think we might see, because of that, a bigger change in the way that government is acting than we expect, because the manifesto at one level looks terribly bland, and we've gone out there and said, look, there's nothing in there on tax. I mean, literally nothing on tax and spending. But actually, you read it, and it actually reads quite differently from the Conservative manifesto and quite differently from what we've got used to. So we might see something quite different. I don't know.
Actually, economic optimism is rising. I mean, again, you wouldn't believe it if you read, we're still one of the best regarded countries on earth. Again, you wouldn't believe that if you read the papers. Maybe things aren't quite as bad as we have been telling ourselves.
Gosh, we're coming out of the gloom here. So it's quite interesting.
It's getting late.
So Hannah, is the sort of Labour agenda around devolution things? I mean, we saw that. Quite surprising result for Ben Houchen against the sort of trend of holding on in Tees Valley, the only sort of Conservative mayor left standing of the ones that we had before with the defeat of Andy Street. But do you think there will be renewed emphasis on devolution, going deeper with devolution as well as to more places?
Well, I think the key question, of course, is the money and whether it looks attractive to Rachel Reeves once she's in the Treasury to devolve power over taxation and so on, even in minor ways to local areas, is, it will look different to her once she's there, and that would be, I guess, the big question. The thing I was thinking when you were talking about, in response to the question, is there are contradictory things at play for Labour, because of course they will want to deliver some quick wins. They will want to show some things have changed in terms of numbers on things, even if they don't feel different for lots of people on the ground. But of course their governing philosophy, which they've talked about a lot, is this idea of missions, and the whole point about missions is that they are long-term, and that they are objectives that you set, and you don't necessarily know precisely how you're going to get there, but you build the coalitions and you give the leadership, and you, importantly, drive your spending review in such a way that it should fund these long-term objectives. And I think the really interesting question, the Conservatives have still, I think, in the context of this election campaign, talked about Liam Byrne's sort of note and, there is no money. For how long will the British public wear the line, which is doubtless coming to us very soon, about, the Conservatives have left us with no money, this is all very terrible. How long will that last? How long will people give them the benefit of the doubt and the ability to try for this missions sort of focused approach? I think it's an admirable thing to try to do, to look more long term, to look in a more cross-cutting way. Those are definitely objectives that we would endorse from the IFG. But whether the British public has the patience for that sort of approach, I think, is an important question.
Okay, let's have some more questions. Yes, at the front here. Yes, gentleman there.
Two parts. One is that given that the UK now will have something looks like a government for at least 5 years, and probably from the Western world is the most stable government politically in terms of what's happening in other societies, and therefore, because of the stability, we've now become more an attractive investment proposition than relative to everybody else, rather than necessarily in absolute terms. And the second thing is, how much do you think Labour would be looking at making major reforms to systems that don't necessarily cost money, but doing things differently and possibly better, whether it be for education, for health reform, or whatever. But if they don't have any money, the best way to make changes is to actually look at how systems operate.
I'm going to ask Laurie first. Do you think that the UK will look like a sort of, stand out as a beacon of stability? And how important to our sort of international economic attractiveness will it be whether Keir Starmer can actually make progress on improving the sort of botched deal with the EU?
So improving the botched deal with the EU will be very difficult. It was botched from our point of view, but not from their point of view. It's not a particular priority. So the things we wanted on the EU are going to be things that they have to give up. I think, look, again, it's from a low base. If you look about the reputation of the UK 2016, 2017, 2018, reaching a crescendo when we have 3 prime ministers in a single year, it was pretty poor. So now we have the working of democracy, which is really important. It's what democracies do. The Russian people, no doubt, would love to be able to do this to Putin, or maybe they won't, but they can't, even if they wanted to. We can. And we've shown that poor government gets punished. That's important. Secondly, the UK is still a big country, still a strong economy. I don't know whether things will turn around or not. But the focus on industrial strategy and growth, just to give an example from defence to sort of link it in with things I know more about. I looked at the manifesto, as one does. There's a reference to AUKUS. AUKUS, for those who don't know, is a trilateral agreement between the United States, Australia and the UK to do a couple of things. One, to build nuclear submarines, and the other to have sort of deregulation on emerging technologies and cooperate. It's really quite important. When you look at and it's quite important, obviously, to another Labour Prime Minister in Australia who endorsed all of this. If you look at the manifesto, it doesn't actually mention that it's about building nuclear submarines. Passes that by, but it says it will give it economic, it will be a boost to the economy. And that's both good and bad, because there's always a risk when you start looking at your defence reviews and so on, that you start thinking about it in terms of industrial policy rather than getting stuff quickly and not just looking after British Aerospace, who happens to provide most of the things we need. And just a final point, I think the first impressions will be important. And this is why the political summit in Blenheim, in which we'll have a sort of small and not particularly important agenda, but a great time for meeting people. And I think that's how that will be used. And the ability of Starmer to start making connections, start listening to what his fellow leaders are worried about, that will be quite an important part of this, or creating a different impression.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because the timing, it's supposed to be happening a bit earlier. Everybody was looking a bit askance at the 18th, this 18th of July timing. But actually, in terms of the election, it's actually quite nice as a sort of handover to Keir Starmer, say, here's an opportunity to meet everybody. I've laid on this almost welcome party for you to host.
It'll be a bit tiring. I think that's the problem. By the time he gets to this, he's going to have no rest. He's going to be thrown in at the deep end, a very steep learning curve, and so on. But these first impressions will be very important.
Well, Tom Baldwin's book tells us that he's a complete workaholic who works all the time, notwithstanding some of those attack ads we've seen, apart from Fridays. Hannah and Paul, I'm quite interested in this point about whether you just by thinking differently about education and health, Wes Streeting's always going on about, don't worry about, the small additions that I think Paul's been quite derisive about. Don't matter about that. Look at that giant budget. There has to be scope for managing that better and delivering better outcomes. You can work together. They've made something of, if you give local authorities longer term certainty, they'll be able to manage better within that envelope. Is there scope actually for delivering better outcomes, through maybe this more inclusive mission-based focused approach with not so much money? Hannah?
Well, I think any substantial public sector reform is going to cost money. That's not to say that working collaboratively, bringing in different sectors, setting longer-term aims and longer-term budgets is not going to enable local authorities, for example, to be more strategic in the way they spend money and so on. But, I defer to Paul, but I don't think it's going to make, those sorts of changes will quickly make a very big difference to people, local people on the ground will feel is making a difference to their lives.
Paul, is the IFS going to be very impressed when they say no extra money, but we're going to manage it all a lot better?
Well, look, there's clearly lots of scope to manage stuff better. Look at the NHS, that's the biggest thing we do by a mile. And productivity in the NHS has collapsed in the last 5 years. It's totally collapsed. We've got more doctors, more nurses, more money.
But no infrastructure.
I was going to come on to that, but we're doing less. Or we're just about doing the same now. Now, part of that is because we haven't invested in the infrastructure over the last 15 years. I was on the Times Health Commission. Two things were just seared into my brain from that commission. One was the infrastructure, particularly the IT infrastructure, is appalling and it causes huge inefficiencies. And the other is the management is appalling and causes huge disengagement and inefficiency. Now, one thing that might happen, again, is this sense of got new ministers, they've got new ideas, they value us, maybe we'll get more out of the workforce. That's a bit wishy-washy, but maybe. But is there scope to have a more productive health service? Yes, of course there is. Will that require some more investment? Yes, of course it will, at least to some extent, but it should be possible to increase the productivity. Two other examples of where I think that there is real scope for change. One is that we have had a literal doubling in the number of people claiming disability benefits each month over the last 2 or 3 years, and the amount that we're spending has gone up by something like, I can't remember, 10, 15 billion in 2019, and it's due to go up by another 15 billion over the next 5 years. Now, getting a handle on that, it's really hard to do, but getting a handle on that could have actually makes lots of, not just money available, but also more people in the workforce. Now, really tough, but that's something they really ought to be focused on. And the third thing where you can see just incredible waste is sort of local authority commissioning of specialist services in social care. And
£1 million kids.
I mean,
you heard of the £1 million kid?
Well, indeed.
It's astonishing.
It's a combination of a very badly set up market, put no regulation, and 156 or whatever it is local authorities each doing the procurement. Now, you can make that better and cheaper. Now, that's not going to save you billions, but those are examples of things that you can do better. But the fact that it isn't done better is an indication of that it's actually quite difficult to achieve. It's no good just sitting in the White House saying, let's do it better. That takes time and it takes real focus.
So, I mean, we were hearing Louise Casey earlier talk about some of the sort of work she's done to try and get government to focus on a specific problem and sort it, and a bit of an argy-bargy with Lord Willetts about how easy it really was to make the system focus on problem solving. So if you had to do it, government, Rachel Reeves calls you up and says, I want you to lead a review into an area where public spending could clearly be done better and produce better outcomes, what would you be volunteering to do as the Johnson review of an area you're going to sort out? Because the incoming government seems like it's quite keen on reviews. Other people in the audience can volunteer their reviews.
I'd like to do lots of reviews, actually. There's definitely disability benefits, there's definitely higher education, there's definitely further education, there's definitely the health.
I can see a whole new career.
There's definitely a career in reviews there. I'd be very happy to take it on.
Okay, Rachel Reeves, listen here. If you've won Leeds West, then come on, do that. More questions? Any more questions from the audience? Yes, there. Then I'm going to come on with one for Ben about what's going on with the SNP in Scotland, because I think that's quite interesting if that result is anywhere near right, though I'm not convinced it is. Yes.
Yes, I had the same question.
Oh, right.
Does that result reflect the de-alignment that was talked about earlier, or pro-unionist tactical voting? And if it is right, what does that mean for the independents that go forward?
So Ben, I think at the SNP conference there was something that was saying we'll use this as a sort of, to get a mandate. If we win a majority of seats in Westminster, then it will be a mandate to open negotiations.
I think that
blah blah blah. He said, sorry.
Our Ipsos in Edinburgh is regularly polling, obviously, on support for devolution and independence, and it's sort of flatlining. It's not anywhere near where it needs to be in order to have another referendum, or I believe allow this Labour government to have one. Let's wait and see when you get into the smaller parties and all of that, it's more difficult. And I think we had the SNP quite high in our last poll. That's one of the things I'm interested in, shall we say, when we're always fascinated by this. But no, I just think it's for to be honest, I think Scottish independence is for the birds. From where we are now, it's just not going to happen. So the SNP, it's just not there. And also the economics of it remain very, very, very challenging. And we're not seeing the sort of movement that you might have expected. I think the fact that, obviously the Scottish National Party was amazing after 2014 in literally obliterating everybody, but since then, of course, satisfaction with public services in Scotland has declined, the shine has come off, corruption, etc., etc., etc. So I'm not getting, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm not getting excited about Scotland on the basis of what I've seen so far, or something seismic changing in Scotland, quite frankly.
Okay, I'm not sure if there are any Scots in the audience.
Sorry, Scott.
To come in on any of that. Yes, Chris. Yeah. Microphone.
Given that we've gone from a landslide majority from the Tories to a landslide, we assume, majority for Labour in one parliamentary term, what do the panel think are the odds of it going the other way the next time round?
Okay, well,
the Ming vase, I think the Ming vase has been carried over the line, but it remains a Ming vase, and so I think that this decline in political loyalty the anti-politics. We've got the lowest trust in politicians that we've measured in each year since 1983. We've got spontaneously people in our monthly poll that we've done since 1974, more, just saying the biggest problem in this country is not Putin or the NHS or the cost of living, it's just politicians. Means that I don't, and if you look at Keir Starmer's personal ratings and, all the rest of it, he does much better than Sunak, but of course it's always compared to what. So, yes, I think there is a risk there. It isn't this is not 1997.
So, Hannah, somebody on the panel wrote a book called Held in Contempt about MPs and what MPs might do to restore their reputation. We've heard one thing is that, trust in politics is all-time low. Big thing to restore trust in politics, you can do that without money. Might actually save you money. You don't have to replace people so often. What would you like to see a new government do, and any suggestion that they're up for that?
I think it's been quite interesting how the Labour line has been, Keir Starmer's line has been, country first, party second. That's been their kind of principal argument. If Boris Johnson had still been the leader of the government, I think we would have seen a much bigger Labour emphasis on standards and so on post-party gate, and we haven't seen that. Labour has talked about its sort of ethics and integrity commission. That it's not entirely clear what that's going to achieve, although it's a welcome sort of sign that that is something that they think is important enough that they put it in their manifesto. I mean, I think the most important thing is what Ben said earlier, is acting when rules are broken, when there's a scandal, acting quickly and showing that it's no longer the case that there's one rule for everyone else and another for friends of the government. That's not an easy thing for a leader to do when it's, inevitably someone close to them, someone who politically, for some reason, it's, difficult to impose consequences on. But I think the setting out what you believe the rules should be and then following the rules to the letter is the absolutely crucial thing. And trust. There's no big bang solution on trust in politics. It's all about the individual decisions, the decisions which, as you are making them, there are a multitude of good political reasons to make the wrong decision, but you have to make sure you make the right one, because those are the things that people just see as reinforcement of this narrative that Ben identifies about politicians being in it for themselves, politicians having one rule for them and another for everyone else, and so it's a cumulative thing, and the accumulation needs to be on the other side of the pile. Whatever we're talking about.
Yeah, a couple of things. First, I think it's really good that Starmer has reached this position without anybody accusing him of being charismatic. I just think charisma is a dangerous thing, and it always leads to letdown and disillusion. So the low expectations is good and helpful in that way. Secondly, so much depends on what happens with the Conservative Party. Back to the question. The Reform number of seats there look quite alarming to me. And we'll see whether it's right or not, all the reasons why it might not be. But if this is going to be a big argument, do we go back to the centre, has always been the assumption is where victory is, but there's Starmer occupying the centre, or do you look at Meloni, do you look at Le Pen and think, and look at the Christian Democrats in Germany who've taken on a much harder edge since Merkel, and that's the way to go. So I think, and it just again going back to France, what did Macron do? He destroyed the centre left and he destroyed the centre right, and so now he's suddenly faced with two extremes. So I think how the opposition handles itself and positions itself is going to be extremely important. And it's not Starmer's problem for now. He can largely, except he's got a large left grouping in his own party. But how that develops, and the things that he will then have to start worrying about. And you even see now with the immigration issue and so on. The immigration issue dominates European politics in many ways, and that's not going to get any easier.
Ben, I just want to come to you on this question. I was going to pick up this question about reform, Farage, and the interaction with the Conservatives, whether Reform have 3 MPs or 13 MPs. They clearly have done quite well in terms of vote share, even if they don't do very well in terms of absolute numbers of seats. But what questions should the Conservatives be asking when they sort of work out where to position themselves?
Personally, I believe it will lead them to ask the wrong question, which is that they will think that you know, it's the classic, you know the David Frum quote, after offering voters ham and eggs, the first and then being rejected, the first reaction is to say, how about double ham and eggs? And it takes 2 or sometimes 3 elections to start listening to the public. So I mean, obviously immigration is a major concern, but doubling down on that and trying, you can't out-reform reform, and there's various aspects of reform that probably under a bit more attention might wither a little. So if you want to go over there, I think, I mean, which is what they did sort of in, after 97 to 2001. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? It didn't, etc., etc. We'll have it. So the risk is they'll do more of that before potentially they come back to the centre. Personally, is what I can see happening almost certainly at the moment. They'll get, we need proper conservatism, Jill. Proper conservatism. Brexit was fine. We just didn't do it right, etc., etc.
Really interesting. And were you surprised, just in terms of the sort of Labour votes and attitudes? We've seen quite a lot of polling. I think John Curtis was publishing something showing British sentiment moving, particularly among Labour voters, really quite firmly towards Brexit was a mistake, rejoin. Were you surprised by Keir Starmer just offering up yesterday?
I did think that was a bit. That was radical, I felt. I mean, but I mean, most people think it hasn't worked, but to me, it's turned into the council tax / poll tax. It's become one of those things that's so toxic. The Conservatives have destroyed themselves over it. You literally can't. At the moment, it's for politicians. It's a bit, it's like toxic waste. So we just don't want to go back to it. I think you'd need to. I mean, I hope personally, I mean, I speak as somebody running an international company and I live in between Paris and London, that we do, but I can see, I think that was very interesting that he decided to do that. And it's almost as though, it's going to take a generational change, which never say never in today's politics, but it is interesting. It didn't really feature in the campaign. I mean, he's got this huge majority without mentioning it. So where's the rejoin party? That's not the Lib Dems. I didn't. While Ed Davey was jumping off things, I didn't hear a huge amount about rejoining the European Union or anything like that. So no, it's a bit, it's just too difficult.
Rejoin the EU party was an option on the ballot paper in my constituency.
And how did it? Well, we'll see how many seats they get.
We don't know how it did. It doesn't seem to get any seats formed by former Conservative MEPs, apparently, so that's quite interesting, whatever. Do you think, I'm just going to ask a final question, then I'm going to hand it over to Bobby to announce the results of the seat prediction, which I have to say I didn't notice, but anyway, and I'm sure I got the right number in retrospect, which I've hidden somewhere. Is electoral reform now going to be talked about in the light of this?
It's going to be talked about, and the party which has managed to get a massive majority on first past the post will find it inconvenient and won't spend any time on it. So,
but will they be worried by the Crispell question that this is quite thick? I mean, okay for now, but actually, if we want to harvest that natural progressive majority for a few more years, to have a decade. A generation of renewal.
I'm afraid I'm cynical. It's a bit like, fiscal devolution to regions or local government. It's a nice idea in opposition, but once you've got your hands firmly on the Treasury, it seems quite convenient not to do it. But let's see. Let's be optimistic.
I'm just going to ask you a quick one as Bobby comes to the stage. Will France be ungovernable on Sunday? Will we all be looking at...
my colleagues are saying it's looking pretty ungovernable, yes. I mean, they may have fended off Mrs. Le Pen for now. She remains the favourite to win in 2027. So Mrs. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mrs. Le Pen, Mrs. Maloney, all having a good time together.
Okay. Well, things were looking up about 40 minutes ago, but I think they've taken a distinct downturn since then. But
can I read out a tweet which I've just seen, which I think is great fun?
Okay.
It's vaguely relevant because it's about Jeremy Hunt, who, I don't know, that's my sort of stuff. Heading to the count at Godalming, if Hunt falls, people are saying it will be the first Chancellor to be deposed while in office by popular will. It may be a comfort, but I don't think that's true. Walter de Stapledon, England's 14th century finance minister, also lost the confidence of the electorate. Without a clear democratic lever for removing him, they burned his house down, beheaded him with a bread knife, and sent his head to Queen Isabella of France. So we have made progress.
Very good. Jeremy Hunt may have got away with it lightly based on that. But could I ask you, before Bobby finally tells us who's won the seat prediction competition, which is based, of course, on the exit poll rather than what actually happens, I assume. Otherwise, you're waiting here a really long time to find the result. Could you just thank my fantastic panel, Paul Johnson, Ben Page, Hannah White, and Lawrence Friedman.
I think I'm being turned on. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. So this won't take long. Long night, brilliant night, absolutely brilliant night. But I do have the pleasure of announcing the winner of the seat prediction quiz. We've had our own bunker out the back with our analysts working hard on a spreadsheet with simple formulas, not masses of code, but we've crunched all the numbers. We've been through it. Unfortunately, did you enter, Jill? You didn't enter.
I didn't even notice it.
Okay, good. Well, you didn't win. So we had 182 people entered. The winner got within 5 on the majority, 6 on the Conservative seats, and very close to the sample size, which we got secretly passed to us by Ben, which was 20,421 was the exit poll seat. That was actually the 8:45 cutoff. They still feed in data after that. So the winner is Amelia Braddon. Amelia has gone on to a party. I can't believe Amelia left before claiming this amazing prize, but instead we've got Abby to accept on Amelia's behalf, so well done. Well done, Abby. Brilliant, congratulations to Amelia. So all that's left for me to do is to thank you, the big thank yous. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the people online. We had over 1,000 people signed up for the online stream. To the incredible team who put this together for us, particularly Sophia, Rosie and George, but many others too. Finally, thanks to our incredible panellists, all the speakers and chairs for tonight. We're finishing now, but there are many other events and parties around. We, not least, as I said at the beginning, our very good neighbours at LSE and our very good friend Tony Travers. So if you do want to hear more, they go till 2 a.m. But whatever your plans are, you can't stay here. You can have a quick, everyone can have a quick drink if they like, but we need to have people gone by about 12, before 12, sorry, I shouldn't have said 12, before 12. And if you're leaving, please leave by floor 1, not floor 0. There's no way out on floor 0, so leave by floor 1 and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much. Thank you, brilliant. Brilliant.